It began not as a division, not as a battlefield unit, not as a sword of war, but as a small group of men standing outside a political headquarters in Munich. They wore black uniforms, polished boots, and a strange kind of devotion in their eyes. Their duty was not to protect a nation, not to guard a front line, but to guard one man whose ambition would plunge the world into fire. They called themselves the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, and they were born as a bodyguard regiment, a personal shield around Hitler, selected for loyalty above all else. In time, that shield would transform into one of the most feared formations of the war. It began with a handful of men in peacetime parades. It ended with tanks in the ashes of Berlin. This is the entire story of the Leibstandarte Division, Hitler's elite bodyguard regiment, the formation that followed him from the first rally to the final bunker. The men selected for the Leibstandarte were not chosen for experience. They were chosen for belief. Young, physical, impressionable, often recruited straight out of the Hitler Youth, they were trained to see obedience not as a virtue, but as identity. They were forged in discipline. They were shaped in ideology. Their loyalty was not to Germany, not to law, not even to military command. It was to one man's vision. When Hitler looked at them, he saw the embodiment of the future he imagined: tall, ordered, disciplined, controlled. What they saw in him was destiny. That devotion became the foundation upon which their transformation would be built. When war erupted in 1939, the Leibstandarte expected parade ground duties and ceremonial guard work. Instead, they were thrown into the chaos of Poland, and their baptism into combat came not with glory, but with brutality. Behind the lightning-fast advance of panzers, the Leibstandarte moved into towns and villages where orders were vague and morality even vaguer. They were not merely soldiers, they were enforcers. And Poland became a place where ideology and violence fused. Prisoners were executed, civilians were shot. What happened there was not an accident, it was a preview. During the invasion of France in 1940, the Leibstandarte operated with speed and aggression, pushing through the Ardennes with a ferocity that shocked even hardened Wehrmacht officers. There, on the quiet farmland near Wormhout, a dark stain marked their legacy, again the massacre of surrendered British soldiers. The message was unmistakable. The Leibstandarte did not believe in the rules of war. They believed in victory at any cost, and yet as their brutality grew, so did their reputation. Hitler rewarded them. Promotions came. Expansion followed. What began as a bodyguard regiment grew into a brigade, then a division, then a mechanized panzer corps. The Leibstandarte evolved into a spearhead of offensives, a shock force used when Hitler wanted a breakthrough. They fought in Greece, where mountain passes echoed with the thunder of their boots. They fought in Yugoslavia, where cities burned. Each victory fed the myth. Each atrocity fed the truth. But the greatest transformation of the Leibstandarte came on the Eastern Front, a front where the winter killed as efficiently as bullets, where supply lines vanished into snow, and where both sides believed the other was less than human. The Leibstandarte fought at Kharkov, where their counterattacks stunned Soviet forces. They drove tanks into burning cities, dashed through collapsing fronts, and executed maneuvers that military historians still study. But every step forward left ashes behind. Their courage could not be separated from their cruelty. Their battlefield brilliance could not be separated from the ideology that drove them. By 1943, the Leibstandarte had become a fully armoured division, a steel fist wrapped in black cloth. They fought at Kursk, the largest tank battle the world had ever seen, where firestorms rolled across, endless wheat fields, and metal burned under the summer sun. Their panzers smashed into Soviet defences, guns roaring, tracks grinding into the earth. But even the elite could not stop the tide. Kursk broke the offensive power of the Reich. After that, the Leibstandarte was always retreating. Normandy came next. The Allies landed. The sky filled with aircraft. The hedgerows of France became a labyrinth of death. The Leibstandarte fought relentlessly, launching counterattacks against the British, Canadians, and Americans. Villages turned to ruins. Roads became graveyards for tanks. And in that chaos came another war crime, the execution of Canadian prisoners, shot near the Abbaye d'Ardennes. Again, the same pattern. Skill paired with savagery, discipline paired with brutality. The Leibstandarte led the northern spearhead of the attack. They smashed through American lines, pushing toward the Meuse River. They made the deepest penetration of the offensive. But fuel ran out. Roads clogged. Resistance stiffened. The offensive collapsed. And with it collapsed the last fantasy of German victory. In 1945, as the Reich crumbled and Berlin burned, what remained of the Leibstandarte defended the ruins of a dying regime. Tanks without fuel sat buried in rubble. Soldiers who once marched in perfect formation now crawled through sewers and basements, fighting block by block, street by street. In the end, they were not defending maps, or strategy, or victory. They were defending a dream that had already died. When Berlin fell, the Leibstandarte ceased to exist. Their story became a legend. Their crimes became a record. Their loyalty became a warning. The Leibstandarte believed they were building a future. What they built was a graveyard. Today, history does not look at them as heroes or elite warriors. It looks at them as proof of what happens when a uniform demands obedience instead of morality, when loyalty replaces conscience, when skill is used not to protect but to destroy. They remind us that the most dangerous soldiers are not those who lack discipline, but those who give their discipline to the wrong master. Tonight, we return to the beginning, to the parade ground, to the Bodyguard regiment that became a division of steel, to the men who followed one man's vision into the abyss. This is the entire history of the Leibstandarte division, born to protect a dictator, forged into a weapon, and consumed by the very ideology that created it. Before we begin, tell me where in the world are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you tonight? Are you somewhere warm and peaceful? Or can you almost feel the cold wind of history brushing against your skin as the past begins to speak again? Wherever you are, take a deep breath, settle in, and let me know. I'd love to hear where in time and place you're joining us from tonight. And one more thing, if these long, quiet journeys into history help you relax, focus, or fall asleep, please consider subscribing. Your support tells YouTube that this kind of deep storytelling still matters, and it tells me to keep creating these for you. March 17th, 1933, Berlin's Lichterfeld Barracks. 120 men stand in perfectly straight lines on a parade ground that once trained Prussian cadets, their boots gleaming in the weak morning sun. They are not soldiers yet, not really. They are butchers, factory workers, former Freikorps street fighters, and unemployed veterans who answered a cryptic recruitment notice, calling for racially pure Germans willing to swear an oath, not to a nation, but to a man. Behind them, the barracks building looms like a judgment, its windows dark and watching. In 6 years, these men will spearhead the invasion of Poland. In 12 years, they will be synonymous with war crimes across 3 continents. But today, they are simply waiting, uncertain, knowing only that they have been selected for something that will change them forever. The man inspecting them looks more like a butcher than a military commander because he was Joseph Sepp Dietrich, 40 years old, stocky and barrel-chested, walks the ranks with the gait of someone who learned command in beer halls and street battles rather than military academies. His face carries the permanent scowl of a man who trusts violence more than words. During the Great War, he served as a tank crewman and earned the respect of common soldiers, though Prussian officers dismissed him as crude and uneducated. He participated in Adolf Hitler's failed beer hall putsch in 1923, cementing a loyalty that ran deeper than ideology, a personal bond forged in shared failure and resurrection. Now Hitler, newly installed as Chancellor, has given Dietrich a mission: create a guard unit that embodies absolute loyalty, physical perfection, and unwavering obedience. Dietrich looks at these 120 men and sees raw material, not soldiers. The selection process that brought these men here resembled a grotesque audition more than military recruitment. Each candidate required proof of Aryan ancestry, stretching back 3 generations, documented with birth certificates and church records, examined by SS genealogists. Height requirements started at 5 feet 11 inches, towering by 1930s standards, ensuring the unit would literally look down on most Germans. Age limits ranged from 17 to 22, young enough to be moulded, old enough to fight. Physical examinations checked for everything from dental health to body symmetry, seeking the Nordic ideal promoted in propaganda films. Nazi Party membership was mandatory, but not sufficient. Recruiters wanted men with combat experience or paramilitary backgrounds, those already comfortable with violence. Those who passed entered a world where their lives belonged entirely to the SS, and through the SS, to Adolf Hitler himself. The unit's official designation changed multiple times in its first year, reflecting uncertainty about its purpose. Initially called the SS Stabswacht Berlin, literally SS Headquarters Guard Berlin, it suggested ceremonial duty. By September 1933, it became Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, a grandiose title borrowing from Prussian military tradition where elite regiments bore royal names. Leibstandarte translated roughly as Lifeguard Standard or Bodyguard Regiment, evoking medieval knights sworn to protect their lord. The Adolf Hitler cipher, embroidered on their standard, made the feudal relationship explicit. These men served a person, not a state. Wehrmacht generals watched this development with contempt and concern, recognizing that Hitler was creating a parallel military structure answerable only to him. They dismissed the Leibstandarte as asphalt soldiers' parade ground, ornaments without combat value. This contempt would last approximately 6 years. Training during 1933 and 34 focused more on propaganda than warfare. The Leibstandarte drilled endlessly for public appearances, practicing the exaggerated goose-step march that looked impressive but destroyed knees and wasted energy. They stood motionless for hours at Nazi rallies, human statues demonstrating superhuman discipline. July 17, 1933, marked their first major public appearance, standing guard at a massive rally where 120 men remained frozen in formation for 4 straight hours without water, food, or bathroom breaks. Several collapsed from heat exhaustion, but those still standing never moved to help them, understanding that the demonstration was the point. Civilians gawked and whispered. Hitler watched from his balcony, nodding approval. This was not military utility, but political theatre, creating an aura of invincibility around the regime's leadership. Yet beneath the theatrical surface, something darker was growing. The Leibstandarte recruited heavily from the SA Hitler's brown shirt stormtroopers, selecting those most committed to political violence. Many had criminal records for assault, some for manslaughter during street battles with communists. They brought with them an understanding that political power flowed from fear, that violence was not aberrant but essential. Sepp Dietrich encouraged this mentality, dismissing military formality in favor of aggressive instinct. He told his men that traditional soldiers followed rules, but SS men created new rules through action. Training incorporated live ammunition exercises considered recklessly dangerous by Wehrmacht standards, emphasizing aggression over safety. The message was clear. Elite status came not from education or refinement, but from willingness to do what others would not. Expansion came rapidly as the Leibstandarte proved useful for regime security. By the end of 1933, the unit grew from 120 men to 1,000. Barracks at Lichterfeld underwent expansion, transforming the facility into an SS showcase. Recruits received better pay than Wehrmacht soldiers, better food, better accommodations, creating resentment among regular military units but ensuring loyalty among Leibstandarte members. Equipment came new rather than surplus, uniforms tailored rather than issued, weapons cleaned to obsessive perfection. This material privilege separated them from both civilian society and military peers, fostering an identity as a chosen elite. They began to see themselves as Hitler's Praetorian Guard, modern incarnations of ancient Roman soldiers who protected emperors and toppled governments. History suggested such arrangements rarely ended well, but in 1933, that history seemed distant and irrelevant. The Leibstandarte's relationship with the Wehrmacht started poisonous and only deteriorated. Army officers saw the unit as a political toy, SS men playing soldier without understanding military culture. Wehrmacht commanders resented the resource priority given to what they considered glorified bodyguards, vehicles, weapons, and fuel diverted from professional soldiers to amateurs in black uniforms. The SS wore different uniforms, used different rank structures, answered to different chains of command, creating friction at every interaction. When Wehrmacht and Leibstandarte units shared training grounds, fistfights erupted regularly, officers turning blind eyes to mutual contempt. This rivalry would later have operational consequences, but in the early years it simply meant isolation, the Leibstandarte developing separately from German military tradition, creating its own culture rooted in ideology rather than professionalism. By 1934, the Leibstandarte had become something unique in modern military history, an ideological combat force without combat experience, elite soldiers without actual battlefields, guards who spent more time planning security than fighting enemies. They studied military theory but practiced crowd control. They trained in weapons but used them primarily for demonstrations. Veterans of the Great War, common among the ranks, grew frustrated with endless parade ground duty, wondering when they would test themselves against real opponents. That opportunity came sooner and more horrifically than anyone expected, though the enemies would not be foreign soldiers but German members of the SA, the very organization from which many Leibstandarte troops originated. The unit's first blood would be German blood, spilled on Hitler's orders, creating bonds of guilt that would chain these men to their Führer through shame as much as loyalty. The oath ceremony remained burned into every Leibstandarte soldier's memory. Each man swore, "I pledge to you, Adolf Hitler, as Führer and Chancellor of the German Reich, loyalty and bravery. I vow to you and to the leaders you set for me absolute allegiance until death. So help me God." The words differed fundamentally from Wehrmacht oaths, which pledged loyalty to Germany and its constitution. Leibstandarte men swore personal fealty, a feudal relationship that superseded law, nation, or moral principle. This oath shaped everything that followed, every crime, every atrocity, every moment of fanatical courage. When traditional morality conflicted with orders, the oath provided justification. When military logic suggested retreat, the oath demanded attack. When basic humanity urged mercy, the oath commanded ruthlessness. 120 men spoke these words in March 1933. By war's end, hundreds of thousands would swear similar oaths, but the Leibstandarte spoke them first, becoming the template for all Waffen-SS divisions. Life in the Leibstandarte created a separation from normal society that resembled monastic orders more than military service. Soldiers lived in barracks, ate together, trained together, spent virtually all waking hours within the SS community. Marriage required permission from superiors, who investigated potential wives for racial purity and ideological reliability. Social circles contracted to SS families, creating an insular world where everyone shared assumptions about German superiority and Jewish conspiracy theories. This isolation intensified groupthink, making dissent psychologically impossible and morally unthinkable. Men who might have questioned orders in civilian life found themselves surrounded by peers who considered such questions treasonous. The few who expressed doubts were quietly transferred or dismissed, maintaining ideological purity through selective pressure. What remained was a brotherhood bound by shared belief that they were Germany's finest, chosen to perform tasks ordinary men could not stomach. Political indoctrination accompanied every aspect of training. Unlike Wehrmacht units, which maintained some separation between military instruction and political education, the Leibstandarte integrated ideology into everything. Lectures on weapons maintenance included discussions of racial struggle. Physical training incorporated rhetoric about German warrior tradition. Evening activities featured films and speeches about Jewish Bolshevik threats and German racial destiny. The SS newspaper, Das Schwarze Korps, provided required reading, filling minds with conspiracy theories and apocalyptic visions of racial conflict. This constant immersion achieved what explicit commands could not. It made atrocity seem not just acceptable, but necessary. When the moment came to murder unarmed prisoners or massacre civilians, these men would not see victims but enemies in an existential struggle. The groundwork was laid in 1933, long before war began. By early 1934, the Leibstandarte had reached approximately 2,600 men, organised along military lines with companies, battalions, and support units. They conducted weapons training with Mauser rifles and MG-34 machine guns, learned tactical manoeuvres for urban and rural combat, practiced coordination between infantry and support elements. Veterans recognised that behind the propaganda facade, real military capability was developing. Sepp Dietrich, despite his rough manners and limited education, proved surprisingly effective at organisation, delegating technical training to competent subordinates while maintaining personal loyalty through crude charisma and shared background. His men called him Sepp rather than using formal titles, intimacy unthinkable in traditional military units. This informality created loyalty stronger than discipline because it felt like brotherhood rather than hierarchy. When Dietrich gave orders, men obeyed not from fear but from personal devotion, a dynamic that made the unit simultaneously more effective and more dangerous. The Leibstandarte's first major test loomed on the political horizon, though few recognised it. Ernst Röhm, leader of the 3 million strong SA, had grown increasingly demanding about the SA's role in the new Germany. He envisioned the SA absorbing the Wehrmacht, creating a people's army led by revolutionary veterans like himself rather than aristocratic Prussian generals. Hitler faced a choice: support his longtime ally Rome and alienate the Wehrmacht, whose support he needed for rearmament, or sacrifice Rome to appease military leaders and consolidate power. The decision came easily. Hitler never allowed loyalty to interfere with power. What remained was execution, and for that he turned to the Leibstandarte, the only military force whose loyalty to him personally exceeded all other considerations. The unit that spent 18 months preparing for ceremonial duty was about to become an execution squad, and that transformation would define everything that followed. The summer of 1934 approached with Berlin thick with rumours and tension. SA leaders talked openly about the Second Revolution, claiming the Nazi seizure of power was incomplete without fundamental social restructuring. Wehrmacht officers warned Hitler that continued SA agitation would provoke military intervention, potentially toppling the regime entirely. The SS, led by Heinrich Himmler, provided Hitler with fabricated intelligence about an imminent SA putsch, giving justification for preemptive action. The Leibstandarte received vague warnings to prepare for emergency deployment, without details about the enemy or mission. Soldiers cleaned weapons, checked ammunition, and waited for orders, assuming they would face communists or foreign agents. None suspected they would soon be murdering unarmed Germans in prisons and private homes, beginning their transformation from bodyguards to killers. The oath they swore pledged loyalty until death, but nobody had explained that it might mean becoming death itself. June 30th, 1934. Dawn breaks over Bad YC, a small Bavarian resort town on Lake Tegernsee. Ernst Röhm, commander of the 3 million strong Sturmabteilung, sleeps in room number 10 of the Hanselbauer Hotel, exhausted from a late night of drinking and conversation with his SA leadership. 2 doors down, SA Obergruppenführer Edmund Heiners shares a room with his 18-year-old male companion, both still asleep after their own late-night activities. The hotel sits peaceful and quiet, morning mist rising from the lake. Then engines rumble in the distance, growing louder. Trucks filled with Leibstandarte soldiers in black uniforms arrive at high speed, brakes squealing. Adolf Hitler himself emerges from the lead vehicle, face twisted with theatrical rage, revolver in hand. Within minutes, the hotel erupts in shouting, crashing doors, and brutal violence. The Night of the Long Knives has begun, and the Leibstandarte's real education in murder is about to start. Hitler personally led the raid, bringing approximately 100 Leibstandarte troops and several SS officers as his strike force. The convoy had driven through the night from Munich, where Hitler first confronted SA leaders at the Brown House Party headquarters, screaming accusations of treason before ordering arrests. Now, at 6:30 in the morning, Leibstandarte soldiers crashed through the hotel, dragging SA leaders from their beds. Röhm answered his door in nightclothes, confused and vulnerable, facing the man he called Adolf with obvious bewilderment. Hitler reportedly screamed, "You are under arrest for high treason," though no legal process existed to justify such charges. Edmund Heines, caught in bed with his companion, was dragged naked into the hallway before being allowed to dress, then beaten savagely by Leibstandarte troops who combined political violence with homophobic rage. Other SA officers, awakened by commotion, emerged from rooms to face rifle barrels and fists. The disciplined bodyguards they had dismissed as parade ground soldiers, now demonstrating a different kind of discipline. The arrested SA leaders were loaded into trucks and driven to Munich's Stadelheim prison, where the real horror began. Röhm was placed in a cell, initially spared as Hitler hesitated to execute his oldest political ally. But the other SA leaders faced immediate execution, shot in the prison courtyard by Leibstandarte firing squads, organised with businesslike efficiency. Edmund Heines died first. His last words reported as Heil Hitler, before the bullets struck loyalty, persisting even in the face of betrayal. SA Obergruppenführer August Schneidhuber went next, followed by Heine's companion and several other senior SA officers. The executions followed no legal procedure, no trial, no formal charges, just names on a list, and men with rifles. Leibstandarte soldiers who participated later described the experience with surprising detachment, as though they had performed maintenance tasks rather than murder. This emotional dissociation would become a characteristic of the unit, enabling atrocities by transforming killing into administrative procedure. While Hitler conducted operations in Bavaria, Sepp Dietrich commanded a separate Leibstandarte detachment in Berlin, tasked with executing SA leaders and other regime enemies in the capital. His target list went far beyond SA personnel, including conservative politicians and military officers who had opposed Hitler's rise. Former Chancellor Kurt von Schleicher, who had manoeuvred against Hitler in 1932 and 33, topped the list. June 30th, around noon, a Leibstandarte squad arrived at Schleicher's villa in suburban Berlin-Neuburg. When Schleicher answered the door, soldiers forced their way inside and shot him multiple times in the hallway. His wife, Elisabeth, emerged from another room and was also shot dead, collapsing beside her husband. The killers left immediately. No witnesses arrested. No evidence collected state-sanctioned murder without pretense of legality. Word spread rapidly through Berlin, creating terror among anyone who had ever opposed the Nazi regime. The executions at Lichterfeld Barracks, Leibstandarte's home base, demonstrated how the unit transformed from ceremonial guards to execution specialists. 6 SA leaders were brought to the barracks and shot against the same walls where Leibstandarte soldiers had conducted drill practice. Bodies were left in the courtyard throughout the day as object lessons for anyone who witnessed them. Soldiers not directly involved in execution stood guard, watched, or conducted normal duties within meters of the corpses, normalizing death as part of their environment. This psychological technique, whether deliberate or accidental, proved remarkably effective. By making murder routine rather than exceptional, it reduced the cognitive dissonance that might have produced resistance or trauma. Men who might have been horrified by execution orders in isolation found themselves surrounded by peers treating killing as professional obligation, making participation seem not just acceptable but expected. Ernst Röhm's execution came last, after 2 days in his cell, while Hitler debated his fate. Other Nazi leaders, particularly Himmler and Goering, insisted that leaving Röhm alive would appear weak, potentially inspiring SA resistance. On July 1st, 2 SS officers entered Röhm's cell and placed a loaded pistol on the table, offering him the honour of suicide. Röhm refused, reportedly stating, "If Adolf wants to kill me, let him do the dirty work himself." After 15 minutes of waiting, the officers returned and shot Röhm twice at point-blank range. The execution witnessed by a Leibstandarte guard outside the cell. With Röhm's death, The purge's primary objective was complete, the SA's leadership decapitated, its political ambitions destroyed, its threat to Wehrmacht primacy eliminated. The Leibstandarte had proven itself useful for the regime's dirtiest work, establishing a pattern that would persist throughout its existence. The total death toll remains uncertain, with estimates ranging from 85 to over 200 victims murdered across Germany between June 30th and July 2nd, 1934. Official Nazi sources later admitted to 77 deaths, claiming all were traitors caught planning a putsch. Independent historians identified at least 190 confirmed victims, including SA leaders, political opponents, Catholic activists, and people killed through personal vendettas or mistaken identity. The Leibstandarte directly participated in approximately 30 to 40 executions, concentrated in Munich and Berlin. Other SS and Gestapo units handled additional killings in Hamburg, Silesia, and other regions. The purge succeeded beyond Hitler's expectations. The SA ceased functioning as an independent political force. The Wehrmacht expressed satisfaction at the elimination of military rivals, and conservative elites congratulated themselves for Hitler's restoration of order, failing to recognise they had applauded their own eventual destruction. International reaction ranged from shock to cautious approval, revealing how thoroughly many observers misunderstood the Nazi regime's nature. British newspapers published editorials praising Hitler for decisively handling internal disorder, comparing him favourably to leaders who tolerated political chaos. French conservatives, terrified of leftist revolution, viewed the purge as necessary authoritarianism. Even some German conservatives, including President Hindenburg, sent congratulations for Hitler's statesmanlike courage. Only perceptive observers recognized the precedent being set that the Nazi regime considered itself above law, that political murder had become state policy, that the forces carrying out these murders were becoming a parallel military structure answerable to no authority except Hitler personally. The Leibstandarte had crossed a threshold from which there was no return, binding themselves to Hitler through shared guilt and setting the pattern for their later crimes. The psychological impact on Leibstandarte soldiers varied but followed predictable patterns. Some men expressed pride in their actions, believing they had saved Germany from traitors and prevented civil war. These soldiers internalized the propaganda completely, viewing murder as patriotic duty. Others struggled privately with what they had done, particularly those who executed people they personally knew from their SA days. But expressing such doubts became impossible within the unit's culture, where questioning orders implied disloyalty to comrades and Führer alike. A few soldiers requested transfers, or simply disappeared, presumably deserting. But their numbers were small and carefully hidden from official records. The majority adapted through psychological compartmentalization, separating their actions from moral judgment and focusing on professional execution of orders. This adaptation would serve them well, or rather, serve their commanders well, when far greater atrocities beckoned. Hitler's reward for the Leibstandarte came swiftly and generously. On July 13, 1934, he addressed the Reichstag and publicly praised the SS and Leibstandarte for their loyalty and duty during the crisis, explicitly exempting them from any legal accountability. Funding increased dramatically, authorization granted to expand to 3,500 men, priority status secured for equipment and resources. Sepp Dietrich received promotion and personal commendation from Hitler, cementing his position as one of the regime's most trusted enforcers. The Wehrmacht, initially pleased by the SA's destruction, gradually realized they had helped create a rival military force with fewer scruples and greater ideological commitment. But by then, the pattern was set. The Leibstandarte had proven its usefulness for tasks the Wehrmacht would not perform, creating a niche that ensured its survival and expansion. The legal aftermath of the Night of the Long Knives demonstrated the Nazi regime's complete contempt for rule of law. Hitler initially claimed the executions occurred under emergency state authority to prevent a putsch. When this explanation proved legally insufficient, the regime simply passed a retroactive law on July 3rd, 1934, declaring all actions taken during the purge to be legal self-defense of the state. This law regarding measures of state self-defense made murder legal by legislative fiat. establishing the principle that the regime could legalize any action after the fact. For Leibstandarte soldiers, this meant their killings carried no legal consequences, no courts-martial, no investigations, no punishment. Instead, they received medals, promotions, and enhanced status. The lesson was unmistakable. Loyalty to Hitler superseded all other moral and legal obligations, and that loyalty would be rewarded regardless of the crimes it required. Historians later debated whether the Night of the Long Knives represented a turning point or merely revealed existing reality. Some argued it marked the moment Nazi Germany became a criminal state, crossing from authoritarian government to murderous tyranny. Others contended it simply made explicit what was always implicit in Nazi ideology, that power derived from violence, that enemies would be eliminated without mercy, that law served power rather than constraining it. For the Leibstandarte, such debates were irrelevant. They had tasted blood, received praise for killing, and learned that absolute obedience brought rewards rather than punishment. The unit's character was now set. They were Hitler's Praetorian Guard in the most literal sense, enforcers who would commit any act their patron demanded. The transformation from ceremonial bodyguards to executioners was complete, and the path from execution squad to war criminals stretched straight ahead, each step following logically from the one before. The purge's impact on SS Leibstandarte relations proved particularly complex, as many Leibstandarte soldiers had served in the SA before transferring to the elite guard unit. They had drunk with men they later executed, marched alongside comrades they shot in prison courtyards. This created an internal conflict that most resolved through loyalty to hierarchy following Dietrich's orders, rather than honouring old friendships. But it also created suspicion within the unit, as soldiers wondered whether their fellows might someday turn on them with equal efficiency. The SS structure deliberately encouraged such paranoia, believing that mutual surveillance and fear of denunciation strengthened discipline. The Leibstandarte became not just a military unit, but a community bound by shared guilt and mutual threat, where loyalty was enforced not just by idealism, but by the knowledge that any one of them could be the next victim if they stepped out of line. By autumn 1934, the Leibstandarte had resumed its public duties guarding Hitler, standing at attention during rallies, performing ceremonial functions as though nothing had happened. Casual observers saw the same pristine uniforms and synchronized marching, but the men wearing those uniforms had changed fundamentally. They had learnt that orders superseded conscience, that killing could be rationalized as duty, that their oath to Hitler meant absolute obedience without moral limit. These lessons would be reinforced through combat experience in Poland, France, and Russia, but the essential transformation had already occurred. The Leibstandarte would become one of the most effective combat divisions in military history, but that effectiveness would be inseparable from criminality because the unit's foundation was built on murder. Every subsequent atrocity, executions of prisoners, massacres of civilians, participation in genocide traced back to those 3 days in June and July 1934, when Hitler's bodyguards became Hitler's executioners and discovered they had a talent for it. January 1935, Bad Tölz, Upper Bavaria. Wilhelm Mohnke, 23 years old, recently promoted to SS Untersturmführer, stands in freezing rain watching his platoon struggle through an obstacle course designed by Wehrmacht officers who clearly want the SS to fail. Mud-covered Leibstandarte soldiers crawl under barbed wire, sprint between obstacles, climb walls, while instructors scream insults about political soldiers and parade ground pretties. Mohnke, who participated in the Long Knives executions 8 months ago, knows his men are being tested beyond military necessity. This is humiliation disguised as training. But he also knows they must pass, must prove that the Leibstandarte can transform from Hitler's ceremonial guards into real soldiers. One recruit collapses from exhaustion, vomiting in the mud. Mohnke walks over, pulls the man to his feet, and quietly orders him to complete the course. The recruit does. Staggering but upright, Mohnke notes the name. This is someone who will endure. The Leibstandarte's transformation has begun in earnest. The expansion following the Night of the Long Knives created both opportunity and crisis for the Leibstandarte. Hitler authorized increasing the unit's strength to motorized regiment status, approximately 2,600 men with priority access to vehicles, weapons, and equipment. This generosity came with expectations. The Leibstandarte must become combat capable, not just ceremonially impressive. The problem was expertise. Sepp Dietrich understood street fighting and armored warfare from the Great War, but organizing a modern mechanized regiment required skills he lacked. The SS had few officers with formal military education, having recruited primarily from veterans and Nazi activists rather than professional military circles. The solution was humiliating but necessary, requesting Wehrmacht officers to train the SS. The army agreed, partly to maintain oversight of this rival force, partly to demonstrate SS incompetence. They assigned officers who viewed the assignment as punishment, creating a training environment thick with contempt and resistance. The Wehrmacht instructors brought Prussian military tradition to an organization built on Nazi ideology, creating immediate cultural conflict. Army officers expected formal discipline, proper salutes, respect for rank hierarchy. They encountered Leibstandarte soldiers who called their commanding officer Sepp, who treated military tradition as outdated aristocratic pretension, who believed ideological commitment mattered more than professional expertise. Early training sessions devolved into shouting matches about whether officers deserved automatic respect or needed to earn it through proven leadership. One Wehrmacht major reportedly quit after 2 weeks, declaring the SS untrainable rabble. But others persisted, recognizing that beneath the ideology and informality, many Leibstandarte soldiers possessed genuine military talent. Veterans of the Great War understood tactics and weapons. Younger recruits demonstrated remarkable physical capability and pain tolerance. What they lacked was organization, coordination, combined arms thinking, the architecture of modern warfare rather than individual fighting skill. Training intensified throughout 1935 and 36, incorporating lessons from Wehrmacht doctrine while maintaining SS distinctiveness. Leibstandarte soldiers learned small unit tactics, how squads coordinated fire and movement, how platoons provided mutual support, how companies exploited breakthroughs. They practiced with MG-34 machine guns until they could set up, fire, displace, and set up again in under 2 minutes. They learned to use mortars, anti-tank rifles, radio equipment. Physical training went beyond Wehrmacht standards. With 25-kilometer forced marches in full equipment, live-fire exercises where bullets passed overhead, hand-to-hand combat that regularly resulted in broken bones. The emphasis remained distinctly aggressive, attack over defense, speed over caution, shock over attrition. Wehrmacht trainers worried this would produce unnecessary casualties in actual combat. SS leadership believed it would produce battlefield dominance through psychological impact and momentum maintenance. Paul Hauser's involvement marked a turning point in Leibstandarte professionalization. A retired Army Lieutenant General, Hauser joined the SS in 1934 at age 54, bringing decades of military experience to an organization desperately needing it. He became inspector of SS Verfügungstruppe, the armed SS units, including Leibstandarte, and began imposing professional military standards. Hauser created training manuals, established officer schools, developed tactical doctrine that blended Wehrmacht professionalism with SS aggression. He visited Leibstandarte training exercises, observing with the critical eye of a veteran professional. His reports praised the unit's physical conditioning and motivation while criticizing tactical sloppiness and insufficient coordination between infantry and support weapons. Sepp Dietrich, who could have resented this aristocratic general's interference, instead recognized his value and cooperated fully. The combination of Dietrich's crude charisma and Hauser's professional expertise created an effective partnership that transformed the Leibstandarte from armed bodyguards into a functioning military unit. Motorization set the Leibstandarte apart from standard Wehrmacht infantry divisions, most of which still relied on horses for transport. The SS received trucks, motorcycles, and light armoured vehicles in quantities that made army commanders jealous and suspicious. This equipment came from 2 sources: direct allocation from Wehrmacht production, using Hitler's personal authority to override normal distribution, and purchasing from civilian manufacturers using SS funds derived largely from concentration camp labor. The moral irony was lost on Leibstandarte soldiers, who simply appreciated having vehicles when army units marched on foot. Motorization changed tactical possibilities dramatically. The Leibstandarte could move quickly to crisis points, advance faster than horse-drawn logistics could sustain, and exploit breakthroughs that immobilized infantry units could not maintain. But motorization also created new vulnerabilities: fuel dependence, mechanical complexity, need for trained maintenance personnel. Early exercises revealed breakdown rates exceeding 40%, trucks overheating, motorcycles breaking down on rough roads, maintenance crews overwhelmed by equipment failures. The first real test came not in combat but in propaganda, the March 1938 Anschluss with Austria. Hitler ordered the Leibstandarte to participate in the peaceful occupation, serving as both military force and political symbol of German-Austrian unity. The unit crossed the border on March 12, 1938, as part of the 8th Army, expecting possible Austrian resistance. Instead, they encountered cheering crowds, flowers thrown at vehicles, Austrian soldiers abandoning defensive positions to join the celebration. For Leibstandarte soldiers, this felt like validation, their aggressive training vindicated by easy victory, their motorized capability demonstrated through rapid advance, their elite status confirmed by participation in this historic moment. But the operation also revealed serious weaknesses. Approximately 40% of Leibstandarte vehicles broke down during the advance to Vienna, a 200-kilometer journey on paved roads. Fuel consumption exceeded projections. Radio communication proved unreliable. Supply coordination was chaotic. Wehrmacht officers filed reports noting these failures, ammunition for their ongoing argument that the SS remained militarily incompetent despite improved training. The Leibstandarte's experience in Austria also exposed ideological tensions within German military culture. Wehrmacht soldiers, many from traditional Prussian military families, viewed warfare as governed by honor codes and international law. The Leibstandarte, indoctrinated with Nazi racial ideology, saw war as existential struggle between races where conventional restraints did not apply. In Austria, this difference remained mostly theoretical. There was no combat, no prisoners, no civilians to abuse, but Wehrmacht officers noticed how Leibstandarte soldiers talked about potential enemies, the casual references to racial inferiority, the apparent eagerness for violence that went beyond professional aggression into something darker. Some army officers requested that their units not be assigned near SS units, expressing concern about contamination of military professionalism. These requests were quietly denied. The regime wanted ideologically committed soldiers, not professionals bound by outdated codes. The Leibstandarte represented the future, or rather, Hitler's vision of the future, and the Wehrmacht would have to adapt or be replaced. By late 1938, the Leibstandarte had reached full motorized regiment status with 3 infantry battalions, an artillery battalion, reconnaissance units, anti-tank companies, engineer platoons, and support services approximately 3,500 combat troops plus support personnel. This was no longer a ceremonial bodyguard, but a combined arms force capable of independent operations. Equipment levels exceeded Wehrmacht standards: newer rifles, more machine guns per squad, better vehicles, priority access to ammunition for training. Funding came through multiple channels: official Wehrmacht, budget allocations, SS independent income, direct grants from Hitler's personal funds. This financial independence from normal military channels meant the Leibstandarte could develop without Wehrmacht oversight, creating a parallel military structure, accountable only to SS leadership and ultimately to Hitler himself. The political implications were obvious, and threatening Hitler was building a personal army that could function independent of the traditional military establishment, potentially even against it. The Munich crisis of September 1938 provided another test short of actual combat. As Hitler threatened Czechoslovakia over the Sudetenland, Wehrmacht units mobilized for potential war. The Leibstandarte deployed to the Czech border, fully equipped and ready for combat operations. For 3 weeks, they maintained readiness, expecting orders to attack fortified Czech defensive positions. Soldiers checked weapons, studied maps, rehearsed assault tactics. Then the Munich Agreement transferred the Sudetenland to Germany without fighting, and the Leibstandarte marched into the region behind Wehrmacht units, again experiencing the strange anticlimax of bloodless victory. But this deployment felt different from Austria. This had been preparation for real war, facing an enemy with modern defences and competent military. Soldiers who participated later described a mixture of relief at avoiding combat and disappointment at missing the test they had trained for. The anticipation of violence, followed by its absence, created psychological tension that sought release. That release would come in Poland 9 months later. Training during the winter of 1938 to 39 reached new intensity, driven by the recognition that war was coming and next time there would be actual combat. Live fire exercises increased, with soldiers learning to attack under artillery support, coordinate with armour, clear buildings under fire. The Leibstandarte established a reputation for accepting training casualties that Wehrmacht units considered unacceptable broken bones from hand-to-hand training, bullet wounds from insufficiently separated live fire lanes, occasional deaths from accidents that could have been prevented with more conservative procedures. SS leadership viewed these casualties as necessary for creating soldiers who would not freeze in actual combat, men conditioned to function under life-threatening stress. Critics saw it as reckless disregard for soldier welfare, sacrificing lives for minimal training benefit. Both perspectives contained truth. The aggressive training did produce soldiers capable of functioning under extreme stress, but it also normalized casualties in ways that would later translate into tactical recklessness under fire. Recruitment patterns evolved as the Leibstandarte expanded, revealing tensions between ideological purity and military necessity. Initial height requirements of 5 feet 11 inches were quietly reduced to 5 feet 9 inches, then 5 feet 8 inches, as finding sufficient Nordic specimens proved impossible while maintaining strength targets. Racial purity requirements remained strict, with extensive genealogical documentation required, but enforcement varied by recruiter. The age range expanded upward, accepting men up to 25 and eventually 30, as combat experience became more valued than youth. Nazi Party membership remained mandatory, but the depth of ideological commitment varied widely. Some recruits were fanatical believers, others saw the SS as path to adventure and status, still others joined because conscription was coming anyway and the Leibstandarte offered better conditions than Wehrmacht service. This ideological diversity would later create internal tensions, particularly as casualties mounted and replacements came increasingly from outside the original SS volunteer base. The final months before war saw a dramatic shift in how Wehrmacht professionals viewed the Leibstandarte. The contempt remained, particularly among aristocratic Prussian officers who saw the SS as upstart commoners. But it was now mixed with grudging respect for capability and wary concern about competition. A December 1938 demonstration exercise showed the Leibstandarte executing a textbook combined arms assault infantry advancing under artillery cover, engineers breaching obstacles, machine gunners providing suppressive fire, all coordinated through radio communication with timing that matched German staff planning standards. Wehrmacht observers, expecting failure, instead watched a performance that met professional military standards, while maintaining the aggressive tempo that characterized SS tactics. The report filed by the observing general noted remarkable progress and combat potential while carefully avoiding any language that might suggest the SS had achieved parity with army units. But the implications were clear. The Leibstandarte had become a real military force, and when war came, they would be more than ceremonial observers. Wilhelm Mohnke, now SS Obersturmführer commanding a company, reflected on the transformation during a quiet moment in March 1939, 5 years after joining the unit. He had participated in the Long Knives, killing men he knew. He had endured training that broke some recruits physically and psychologically. He had learned to command soldiers who expected leadership through example rather than rank privilege. He had watched the unit grow from a small bodyguard to a mechanized regiment ready for modern war. What he had not done, and what no one in the Leibstandarte had done, was face an enemy shooting back with intent to kill. All the training, all the equipment, all the aggressive tactics remained theoretical until tested in actual combat. That test was 6 months away, approaching rapidly as Hitler's diplomatic games turned toward Poland. Monke felt confident in his men's training and his own leadership, but a small voice in his mind wondered, were they ready for what was coming? And would the aggressive tactics they had learned prove brilliant or suicidal when facing real enemies in real war? September 1st, 1939, 4 o'clock in the morning, the border between Germany and Poland, near Pabianice. Kurt Meyer, 30-year-old SS Obersturmführer, stands beside his company's trucks in pre-dawn darkness, listening to artillery thunder from the west. This is the sound he has trained 5 years to hear: German guns opening the war that everyone knew was coming. Around him, Leibstandarte soldiers check weapons for the 10th time, smoke nervous cigarettes, urinate in ditches because fear accelerates bladders. Most are veterans of nothing except training and Austrian cheers. Most are about to discover what their aggressive tactics mean when the enemy shoots back. Meyer, a former police officer who joined the SS in 1934, projects confidence he does not entirely feel. He knows doctrine, knows his men, knows the objective: advance rapidly, maintain momentum, overwhelm Polish defences before they can establish coherent resistance. What he does not know is whether he can function when bullets are searching for him specifically, personally, attempting to end his existence. In 3 hours, he will learn. The Leibstandarte's first real battle is beginning. The Leibstandarte deployed as part of the 8th Army's advance into Poland, attached to the 17th Infantry Division but operating with significant autonomy. Their mission was straightforward: break through Polish defensive positions near Pabianice, push toward Warsaw, maintain speed to prevent Polish forces from establishing defensive lines. The sector contained elements of the Polish Łódź Army, competent soldiers with decent equipment but inferior numbers and catastrophic disadvantage in air support. At 5:45, the artillery barrage ended and Leibstandarte infantry crossed the border behind reconnaissance elements. Resistance began immediately, Polish machine guns opening from prepared positions, mortars dropping shells along likely approach routes, anti-tank rifles targeting German vehicles. The parade ground disappeared, replaced by noise, confusion, and sudden death. Within the first hour, the Leibstandarte suffered its first combat casualties. 3 soldiers killed by machine gun fire during an advance across open ground, 2 more wounded by mortar fragments. For all the training, nothing had prepared men for the randomness: how a shell landed here but not there, how bullets passed through the space where someone stood seconds before, how death arrived without warning or fairness. September 7th brought the Leibstandarte's first major engagement at Pabianice itself, a town of 30,000 where Polish defenders had established strong defensive positions in buildings and fortified crossroads. The assault began at dawn with artillery support, but the town's streets and structures limited artillery effectiveness. Leibstandarte units advanced into urban terrain, where their motorized speed meant nothing, where every building might hide defenders, where Polish riflemen fired from windows and disappeared before return fire could target them. SS Untersturmführer Wilhelm Monke's company led the attack on the town centre, advancing block by block in textbook clearing operations. But textbook operations don't include the smell of burning buildings, the screams of wounded men, the physical exhaustion of combat, adrenaline sustained for hours. By noon, Monke's company had lost 10 men killed and 30 wounded, approximately 10% casualties in 6 hours. They controlled less than 1/3 of the town. The aggressive tactics that looked brilliant on training grounds were producing attrition rates the Leibstandarte could not sustain. The fighting at Pabianice exposed fundamental weaknesses in Leibstandarte tactical doctrine. The emphasis on speed and aggression worked poorly in urban terrain where defenders held every advantage. Small unit coordination broke down amid confusion, with platoons losing contact with their companies, companies unable to communicate with battalion headquarters. Radio discipline collapsed under stress, everyone trying to transmit simultaneously, creating cacophony rather than communication. Supply coordination proved chaotic, with ammunition brought forward irregularly, medical evacuation improvised rather than systematic. Polish defenders, though ultimately outnumbered and lacking air support, inflicted disproportionate casualties through superior use of terrain and defensive preparation. Wehrmacht officers observing the battle filed reports noting that the Leibstandarte's aggressive tactics produced rapid advances but unsustainable casualties, exactly the critique they had been making since training began. For 2 days, the battleground on house by house until Polish defenders withdrew on September 9th, having delayed the German advance and bloodied the elite SS unit considerably. The aftermath of Pabianice revealed both the Leibstandarte's resilience and something darker gestating within the unit. Despite heavy casualties, morale remained high. Soldiers took pride in having survived their first real battle, in having captured their objective despite fierce resistance. Wounded men, when evacuated, expressed determination to return to their units rather than relief at leaving combat. This esprit de corps impressed Wehrmacht observers and concerned them simultaneously. But parallel to this, military resilience atrocities began appearing in the Leibstandarte's operational area. Polish prisoners were shot after surrendering, their bodies left in ditches. Civilians suspected of firing on German troops were executed without investigation. Jewish residents in captured towns faced particular brutality beatings, arbitrary arrests, property seizures. These incidents remained scattered and small-scale compared to later atrocities, but they established a pattern that would intensify throughout the campaign. The massacre at Borny on September 18th marked the Leibstandarte's transition from scattered war crimes to organised atrocity. In this small town west of Warsaw, Leibstandarte troops gathered approximately 50 Jewish civilians, men, women, and teenagers, and forced them into a town square. The claimed justification was partisan activity, though no evidence existed of any resistance from Borny's Jewish community. What happened next was not combat, not even rough. Justice, but execution. Leibstandarte soldiers shot 42 Jews in the town square, leaving their bodies as warning to other civilians. Survivors later testified about the methodical nature of the killing: no rage, no chaos, just soldiers following orders to murder unarmed people. The massacre was photographed by Wehrmacht soldiers, creating documentary evidence that would survive the war. When word reached army commanders, they filed formal complaints about SS conduct, arguing that such atrocities undermined German security by creating partisan resistance where none had existed. The complaints were quietly filed and ignored. The Leibstandarte continued operations without punishment or investigation. The advance toward Warsaw consumed the rest of September, with the Leibstandarte fighting through Polish defensive positions, suffering steady casualties, and leaving a trail of smaller atrocities behind them. By September 23rd, when Warsaw's siege began, the Leibstandarte had lost 112 men killed and 381 wounded, approximately 15% casualties in 3 weeks of fighting. These numbers were considered high by Wehrmacht standards, where infantry divisions typically suffered 5 to 10% casualties during the entire Poland campaign. The disparity reflected both the Leibstandarte's aggressive tactics and their operational employment. They were repeatedly used as breakthrough troops, attacking the strongest defensive positions rather than bypassing them or waiting for artillery to reduce them. This usage pattern would persist throughout the war, with the Leibstandarte and other SS divisions employed as fire brigades sent to the most difficult sectors. It was simultaneously recognition of their effectiveness and a grinding waste of irreplaceable trained soldiers. Equipment performance during the Polish campaign revealed serious problems that propaganda carefully concealed. Approximately 50% of Leibstandarte vehicles broke down during the campaign, requiring recovery, repair, or abandonment. Trucks overheated, transmissions failed, motorcycles broke down on rough roads. The vaunted motorization that distinguished the Leibstandarte from foot-mobile Wehrmacht divisions became a logistical nightmare, requiring constant maintenance and consuming fuel at rates that supply units struggled to sustain. The unit's advance repeatedly stalled, not due to enemy action, but due to vehicles littering roadsides, mechanics working frantically to keep enough trucks running to continue operations. Tank support, provided by Wehrmacht panzer units rather than SS organic armour, proved unreliable due to coordination difficulties and Wehrmacht resentment about supporting SS operations. These problems would recur throughout the war, never fully solved despite continuous attention and resources. The campaign's end brought both celebration and reflection. On October 5th, 1939, Hitler reviewed Leibstandarte troops during a victory parade in Warsaw, personally decorating Sepp Dietrich with the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross. Wehrmacht generals attended but stood at distance, making their continued contempt obvious. Hitler's speech praised the Leibstandarte's bravery and sacrifice, careful language that acknowledged their casualties while framing them as heroic rather than preventable. For Leibstandarte soldiers, the parade represented validation. They had proven themselves in combat, earned their elite status through blood rather than propaganda. But the price had been steep. 112 dead represented more than 4% of the unit's combat strength, with wounded rates suggesting that within months of sustained combat, the Leibstandarte would be destroyed as an effective fighting force. This attrition arithmetic would haunt German planning throughout the war, never adequately solved despite increasingly desperate measures. The Polish campaign's broader impact on the Leibstandarte's development was profound and contradictory. Militarily, they learned that aggressive tactics produced both results and casualties, that speed could overwhelm defenders but could not eliminate combat's inherent friction, that motorization created as many problems as it solved. Tactically, they identified weaknesses in radio discipline, supply coordination, combined arms integration, and urban warfare technique lessons that would be addressed during the winter of 1939-40. Psychologically, combat survivors developed confidence that bordered on arrogance, a belief that their training and elan made them superior to ordinary soldiers. This confidence was partially justified. They had performed effectively under fire, but it also created dangerous assumptions about German invincibility that would prove catastrophic when facing better prepared enemies. The atrocities committed during the Poland campaign remain the darkest legacy of those September days. Historians later documented dozens of incidents where Leibstandarte troops murdered Polish prisoners, executed civilians, and specifically targeted Jewish communities. These crimes occurred in a legal vacuum Wehrmacht military law technically applied, but enforcement depended on commanders who faced no pressure to investigate SS actions. The Nazi regime's ideological framework, which portrayed the invasion as a racial war against Slavic subhumans and Jewish conspirators, provided justification that many Leibstandarte soldiers accepted uncritically. Others participated not from ideological commitment, but from peer pressure, organizational culture, and the desensitizing effects of combat. The long knives had taught them that killing unarmed Germans brought rewards rather than punishment. Poland taught them that killing unarmed Poles and Jews brought neither punishment nor attention. The lesson was clear. Their oath to Hitler superseded all other moral restraints. Kurt Meyer, who survived the Pabionese fighting and would later command the Leibstandarte division, reflected years afterward on the Poland campaign with a mixture of pride and denial. He emphasized the military achievements, the rapid advance, the breakthrough operations, the successful urban combat despite heavy casualties. He dismissed atrocity allegations as enemy propaganda or the actions of isolated individuals. This pattern of selective memory characterized many Leibstandarte veterans' post-war accounts. They remembered bravery, sacrifice, comradeship, and tactical excellence. They forgot or rationalized the murder of prisoners, the execution of civilians, the specific targeting of Jews. This duality, genuine military effectiveness coexisting with systematic criminality, defined the Leibstandarte throughout its existence. Poland was where that duality became established, where aggressive combat tactics and routine atrocity became twin characteristics of the same unit, inseparable and mutually reinforcing. The unit that marched out of Poland in October 1939 was no longer Hitler's ceremonial bodyguard. They were combat veterans, proven killers in both legitimate and criminal senses, and they were ready for whatever came next. May 10th, 1940, dawn breaks over the Dutch-Belgian border near Maastricht. A Leibstandarte forward artillery observer, 24-year-old SS Oberscharführer Georg Meyer, crouches in a camouflaged position watching the frontier through binoculars. Behind him, the entire regiment waits in assembly areas, engines idling, soldiers checking weapons one last time. The smell of exhaust mixes with morning mist. Radio crackles in his ear, countdown to H-hour, 5 minutes. Maya has spent 6 months training for this moment, studying maps of France and the Low Countries, rehearsing coordination between infantry, artillery, and air support. The Poland campaign taught hard lessons about combined arms warfare. Those lessons have been absorbed, doctrine revised, tactics refined. This time will be different. This time, the Leibstandarte will demonstrate what elite troops can accomplish when properly coordinated with other arms. The artillery barrage begins right on schedule, shells screaming overhead toward Dutch border fortifications. Meyer speaks coordinates into his radio, adjusting fire, watching explosions walk across defensive positions. Minutes later, Leibstandarte infantry crosses the border, moving fast, and this time they know what they're doing. The French campaign began with the Leibstandarte attached to the 9th Panzer Division, part of Army Group B's advance through the Netherlands. Unlike Poland's relatively open terrain, this advance faced prepared defences, modern fortifications, and well-trained armies with significant mechanised forces. The Dutch had flooded defensive sectors, creating water obstacles that channeled attacks into killing zones. Belgian defences included the supposedly impregnable Fort Eben-Emael and extensive field fortifications along expected German approach routes. French forces, considered the world's premier army, waited behind these forward defences with thousands of tanks and the Maginot Line protecting their border. Wehrmacht planners expected the Leibstandarte to encounter serious resistance from the campaign's opening hours. Instead, Luftwaffe dominance and the shock of German combined arms warfare produced rapid collapse of forward defences, allowing the Leibstandarte to advance faster than even optimistic projections suggested. The advance through the Netherlands demonstrated how thoroughly the Leibstandarte had learned from Poland. Radio discipline remained crisp, with units maintaining communication while avoiding the chaotic transmissions that had plagued earlier operations. Supply coordination improved dramatically, with fuel and ammunition trucks moving forward on schedule. Medical evacuation organised through proper channels rather than improvised. Combined arms coordination showed particular advancement infantry called for artillery support that arrived within minutes. Luftwaffe liaison officers, embedded with Leibstandarte headquarters, directed airstrikes against identified strongpoints. Pioneer units moved forward with assault troops rather than following behind. The aggressive tempo remained, but now it was controlled aggression, calculated risk-taking rather than reckless momentum. Wehrmacht officers observing the advance filed reports noting substantial improvement and professional execution, language that suggested surprise at SS competence more than it acknowledged achievement. May 27th brought the Leibstandarte to Wormhout, a small French town near the Belgian border where British forces had established a defensive position covering the Dunkirk evacuation routes. The 2nd Battalion, commanded by SS Hauptsturmführer Wilhelm Mohnke, received orders to clear the town and secure the approaches. British defenders, elements of the Royal Warwickshire Regiment and Cheshire Regiment, had transformed buildings into strongpoints, positioned anti-tank guns to cover approaches, and prepared for determined resistance. The resulting battle consumed most of the day, with British troops fighting from one position to another, inflicting casualties on attacking SS troops before withdrawing to secondary positions. Leibstandarte soldiers, frustrated by stubborn resistance and mounting casualties, grew increasingly brutal as the battle progressed. By late afternoon, approximately 80 British soldiers had surrendered or been captured, disarmed and assembled under guard in a field near a barn. What happened next would become one of the Leibstandarte's most documented war crimes. The Wormhout massacre unfolded with horrifying deliberation. Leibstandarte soldiers forced the British prisoners into a barn, cramming them into a space too small for that. Many men. Then SS troops threw stick grenades through the barn's windows and doors, the explosions killing and wounding prisoners who had no space to escape the shrapnel. Survivors were dragged outside and shot, some individually, others in small groups. A few British soldiers survived by feigning death beneath corpses or hiding in the barn's wreckage. Their testimony collected after the war, described Leibstandarte soldiers laughing during the killings, making casual remarks about dealing with prisoners, showing no emotion beyond irritation at the task's tedium. Approximately 80 men died in the massacre, murdered after surrender in direct violation of the Geneva Conventions and basic military honour. Moncke's battalion was directly responsible, with multiple witnesses identifying specific SS officers and soldiers who participated in or ordered the killings. The contrast between the Wormhout massacre and the Leibstandarte's military performance during the same campaign reveals the unit's fundamental duality. On one hand, they fought effectively, advancing rapidly, coordinating combined arms operations, demonstrating genuine tactical skill. Casualties remained lower than in Poland, 111 killed and 390 wounded during the entire 6-week campaign, suggesting improved tactical proficiency, reduced unnecessary losses. On the other hand, they systematically murdered prisoners, treating the laws of war as irrelevant obstacles rather than binding obligations. These two characteristics were not contradictory, but complementary. The same aggressive mindset that produced rapid advances also produced contempt for enemies who resisted. The same unit cohesion that created effective combat teams also created collective responsibility for atrocities, with no individual soldier feeling personally accountable for group crimes. The breakthrough at the Somme River in early June showcased the Leibstandarte's evolution into a genuinely elite mechanized force. Wehrmacht panzer divisions had achieved the main breakthrough near Sedan, but secondary operations required widening the penetration to prevent French counterattacks from cutting off German spearheads. The Leibstandarte, now experienced in coordinating with armour and artillery, executed a textbook attack on June 5th. Artillery preparation targeted, identified defensive positions. Luftwaffe strikes suppressed French artillery. Then Leibstandarte infantry advanced behind a rolling barrage, maintaining pace with artillery, while engineers cleared obstacles and anti-tank guns engaged French armour. The French defensive line, already weakened by strategic collapse elsewhere, broke within hours. By evening, Leibstandarte units had advanced 15 kilometres, creating a gap that follow-on forces exploited. This was blitzkrieg working as designed: speed, shock, exploitation, and the Leibstandarte executed it with precision that earned grudging Wehrmacht respect. The race toward Vichy and central France revealed both the Leibstandarte's capabilities and their persistent logistical problems. Sepp Dietrich, eager to demonstrate his unit's value, pushed for maximum speed, ordering subordinates to advance regardless of supply status. On June 12th, Leibstandarte reconnaissance elements covered 100 kilometres in 24 hours, outrunning their supply trains and ending the day without fuel, ammunition, or food. This created a dangerous situation: advanced units exposed without support, unable to defend themselves if French forces counterattacked. Fortunately for the Leibstandarte, French military collapse meant no organised resistance appeared. Supply trucks caught up within 36 hours, and the advance resumed. But the incident demonstrated that aggressive tempo could still override tactical judgment, creating unnecessary risk for minimal operational gain. This pattern would recur throughout the war, with the Leibstandarte's speed, sometimes achieving breakthroughs and sometimes creating crises that required other units to rescue them. The campaign's conclusion brought both military validation and renewed controversy. On June 24, 1940, Hitler personally decorated Sepp Dietrich at the Compiègne Forest, site of Germany's 1918 armistice surrender, deliberately chosen for symbolic humiliation of France. Dietrich received the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, one of Germany's highest military decorations, recognition of the Leibstandarte's combat performance. Multiple company and platoon commanders received Knight's Crosses for specific actions. Hitler praised the unit as exemplifying the National Socialist fighting spirit, language that emphasized ideology over professionalism but clearly communicated his satisfaction. Wehrmacht generals attended the ceremony, but their absence of enthusiasm was noted by multiple observers. They recognized the Leibstandarte's combat effectiveness, but resented the resources lavished on SS units and remained suspicious of a military force answering to party rather than army command. The Wormhout massacre investigation revealed how thoroughly the Nazi regime had abandoned any pretense of military justice. British authorities, through neutral channels, provided evidence of the massacre, including survivor testimony and physical evidence from the site. Wehrmacht military prosecutors opened an investigation, partly from institutional concern about military discipline, partly from hope of embarrassing the SS. The investigation confirmed that Leibstandarte troops committed the massacre, identified Wilhelm Mohnke's battalion as responsible, and collected testimony from German witnesses. Then the investigation stopped. Orders from higher authority, likely from Hitler personally, shut down the prosecution. Mohnke faced no charges, suffered no career consequences, and later received promotion. The message to Leibstandarte soldiers was unmistakable: killing prisoners brought no punishment, and institutional protection extended to war crimes committed in pursuit of aggressive operations. The few Wehrmacht officers who protested found themselves transferred to quiet postings, their careers effectively ended for caring about laws of war. Post-campaign expansion reflected the Leibstandarte's proven value to the regime. Hitler authorized increasing the unit to brigade strength, approximately 6,500 men, with additional artillery, anti-tank, and support units. The designation changed to SS Division Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, recognizing its growth beyond regimental size. Equipment priority increased further, with the Leibstandarte receiving vehicles, weapons, and supplies that Wehrmacht divisions desperately needed. This preferential treatment created a self-reinforcing cycle. Better equipment produced, better combat performance, which justified more resources, which enabled further expansion. Wehrmacht commanders recognized the political logic but resented the military consequences. Army divisions fighting with obsolete equipment while SS units received the newest weapons, creating resentment that poisoned civil-military relations and reduced overall combat effectiveness through inefficient resource allocation. The 6 months between the French campaign's end and Operation Barbarossa's beginning saw the Leibstandarte enjoying occupation duty in France and preparing for expansion. Soldiers billeted in French towns experienced the strange peace of military occupation, combat veterans with nothing to fight, warriors maintaining equipment for battles that might never come. Some enjoyed the respite, exploring French culture, learning the language, appreciating wine and cuisine. Others grew restless, finding peacetime discipline more difficult than combat's adrenaline. Training continued but with reduced intensity, maintaining skills rather than developing new capabilities. Ideological indoctrination intensified, filling the time with lectures about racial struggle, Jewish conspiracy theories, and the inevitable conflict with Bolshevism. This indoctrination would prove tragically effective when Germany invaded the Soviet Union, creating mental frameworks that justified the atrocities that followed. The French campaign's legacy for the Leibstandarte was profoundly mixed, militarily. They had validated their elite status through effective combat operations that demonstrated genuine tactical skill. The improvement from Poland was unmistakable: better coordination, lower casualties, more professional execution. Wehrmacht skepticism about SS military competence had not disappeared but had been significantly reduced. The Leibstandarte had earned recognition as a capable combat formation rather than mere propaganda, but morally, the campaign deepened patterns established in Poland. The Wormhout massacre was not an isolated incident, but part of a pattern of prisoner executions and civilian abuses that characterized Leibstandarte operations. The unit's combat effectiveness was inseparable from its criminality, two aspects of the same organizational culture that valued results over restraints and loyalty to Hitler over adherence to law. Individual Leibstandarte soldiers processed these contradictions in various ways, most avoiding any conscious moral reckoning. For many, the campaign validated their self-image as superior soldiers, elite warriors who accomplished missions that ordinary troops could not. The atrocities were rationalized as necessary responses to enemy resistance, unfortunate but inevitable consequences of aggressive warfare. Some genuinely believed the racial ideology that justified treating enemies as subhuman. Others simply followed orders, finding comfort in obedience rather than personal moral judgment. A few felt private guilt or discomfort, but expressed neither, knowing that questioning orders or criticizing fellow soldiers would mark them as unreliable. The organizational culture demanded loyalty to the group above all else, creating conditions where individual conscience could not function even when it existed. This psychological dynamic would intensify in Russia, where the scale of atrocities would dwarf anything seen in Poland or France. The spring of 1941 found the Leibstandarte in occupied France, unaware they would soon deploy to the Balkans for a brief campaign before the main event in Russia. Soldiers enjoyed what would prove to be their last months of relative peace, their last opportunity to write letters home without censors removing descriptions of horror, their last chance to maintain the illusion that they were soldiers rather than war criminals. Some recognized, perhaps unconsciously, that something irrevocable was approaching. Georg Meyer, the forward observer who watched the French campaign begin, wrote his wife in April 1941, describing beautiful Norman countryside and expressing hope the war might end soon. He would die in Russia 4 months later, killed by a sniper's bullet near Zhytomyr. His last letter home, written 3 days before his death, mentioned exhaustion, confusion, and wonder at the distances they were covering. It made no mention of the Ukrainian Jews his unit had helped murder 2 days earlier. Some things could not be written, some experiences could not be shared, and the distance between what Leibstandarte soldiers did and what they could acknowledge to themselves or others was becoming a chasm that would swallow many of them entirely. April 6, 1941. Pre-dawn darkness along the Yugoslav border. SS Sturmbannführer Fritz Witt, 35 years old, battalion commander, studies a map by flashlight inside a command half-track. Around him, Leibstandarte units wait in assembly areas, engines rumbling, soldiers drowsy after a night of fitful sleep in vehicles. The orders came. Suddenly Yugoslavia's government had repudiated the tripartite pact, refusing to align with the Axis powers, and Hitler responded with characteristic rage by ordering immediate invasion. The Leibstandarte, enjoying occupation duty in Romania after moving from France, received 72 hours' notice to prepare for offensive operations through mountainous Balkan terrain against an unknown enemy. Witt fought in France, knows his battalion's capabilities, trusts his company commanders. But this feels different, improvised, rushed, insufficient intelligence about enemy dispositions or terrain. Still, orders, and the Leibstandarte's reputation demands success regardless of preparation. At 5:20 a.m., German artillery opens fire on Yugoslav border positions. Witt folds his map, climbs into the half-track's commander position, and orders his battalion forward into the unknown. The Balkan campaign began as punishment, Hitler's furious response to Yugoslavia's refusal to submit peacefully. Wehrmacht planning staff, already focused on preparations for Operation Barbarossa against the Soviet Union, resented the distraction and delay. But Hitler's rage demanded immediate action. So 12 German divisions, including the Leibstandarte, invaded Yugoslavia from multiple directions on April 6, 1941. The Royal Yugoslav Army, approximately 1 million men on paper, suffered from ethnic divisions between Serbs, Croats, and other groups, obsolete equipment, and defensive plans based on impossible assumptions about Allied support. The invasion coincided with devastating Luftwaffe bombing of Belgrade, killing thousands of civilians and shattering Yugoslav command and control before ground operations even began. The Leibstandarte advanced from Bulgaria through southern Yugoslavia, encountering scattered resistance from Yugoslav units that often dissolved before contact, soldiers deserting to return home or joining the invaders depending on their ethnic identity and political calculations. The advance through Yugoslavia unfolded with surprising ease, the Leibstandarte covering hundreds of kilometers in days with minimal combat. Yugoslav defensive positions, identified on maps, proved abandoned when German forces arrived. Towns surrendered without fighting, local officials appearing with white flags to negotiate bloodless occupation. This was not the stubborn resistance of Poland or the professional defense of France, but military collapse driven by internal political fractures. Croatian units defected en masse, sometimes cheering German forces as liberators from Serbian-dominated government. The Leibstandarte covered 400 kilometers in 11 days. capturing thousands of disorganized prisoners, seizing equipment stockpiles, and suffering fewer than 20 casualties, mostly from vehicle accidents on mountain roads rather than enemy action. For soldiers expecting combat, the campaign felt anticlimactic, though the rapid advance through difficult terrain demonstrated impressive logistical and organizational capability. The real fighting began after the Leibstandarte crossed into Greece on April 10th, encountering Commonwealth forces, primarily Australian and New Zealand divisions, defending mountain passes. These were professional soldiers with modern equipment, fighting from prepared positions in terrain that favoured defence. The Leibstandarte's first objective was Clidy Pass, a narrow mountain defile where Australian troops had established blocking positions with machine guns, mortars, and artillery support. Initial attacks on April 10th failed. Leibstandarte infantry pinned down by accurate fire from positions they could not identify or suppress. This was not the rapid breakthrough of French operations, but grinding mountain warfare where defenders held every advantage. Sepp Dietrich, impatient with the stalemate, personally led a reconnaissance battalion through the pass, attempting to inspire his troops through visible leadership. The move nearly ended in disaster when Australian machine gunners opened fire at close range, killing Dietrich's driver and forcing the reconnaissance vehicles to retreat under heavy fire. The breakthrough at Clidy came through tactical adaptation rather than brute force. Leibstandarte officers identified cliff faces overlooking the Australian positions, routes that appeared impassable but might allow infantry to outflank the defensive line. On April 12th, 2 Leibstandarte companies began climbing, using ropes and pitons, hauling weapons and ammunition up routes that mountain climbers would consider challenging. The climb took 6 hours, conducted partially under fire from Australian troops, who spotted the movement but could not effectively engage targets on cliff faces. By afternoon, Leibstandarte soldiers had reached positions above and behind the Australian defences, creating an impossible tactical situation for the Commonwealth troops. Rather than face encirclement, Australian commanders ordered withdrawal to secondary positions. The Clidy Pass fell to the Leibstandarte through tactical ingenuity rather than casualties, demonstrating that the unit had developed problem-solving capability beyond simple aggressive assault. The advance toward the Corinth Canal demonstrated both Leibstandarte speed and their tendency toward exaggerated claims. On April 20th, reconnaissance elements raced ahead of the main body, covering enormous distances to reach the canal before British forces could destroy the bridge. Leibstandarte reports claimed they captured the bridge intact through rapid advance. Reality was more complex. German paratroopers had secured the bridge in airborne operations hours before Leibstandarte ground forces arrived. But in Nazi propaganda and internal SS accounts, the Leibstandarte received credit for the capture, building their legendary reputation through claims that Wehrmacht units disputed but could not effectively challenge. This pattern of exaggerated achievements characterized Leibstandarte operations throughout the war, genuine tactical successes embellished into propaganda victories, with Wehrmacht accomplishments appropriated or minimized to enhance SS prestige. The Greek campaign's casualties, 95 killed and 342 wounded over 3 weeks, remained modest by Eastern Front standards, but revealed important patterns. Most casualties occurred during the Clidy Pass fighting, where Commonwealth troops demonstrated that professional defenders in mountain terrain could exact heavy prices from even elite attackers. The casualty distribution was not random rifle companies, and assault troops suffered disproportionately, while support units remained relatively safe. This created a growing divide between combat soldiers who faced death repeatedly and support personnel who experienced war primarily through dangerous proximity rather than direct exposure. Combat veterans began displaying subtle contempt for rear area soldiers, creating internal hierarchy based on risk experienced rather than rank held. This pattern intensified throughout the war, with frontline soldiers increasingly alienated from both support troops and higher headquarters staff. The conclusion of the Balkan campaign in early May 1941 coincided with authorization for the Leibstandarte's expansion to full division status. Hitler personally approved the expansion, recognizing the unit's political value and genuine military utility. The division would number approximately 10,796 men, organized with 3 infantry regiments: artillery regiment, reconnaissance battalion, anti-tank battalion, engineer battalion, and support services. This represented approximately triple the strength of the original regiment, requiring massive recruitment and training programs. More significantly, it created pressure to maintain combat reputation, while integrating thousands of recruits who lacked the original Leibstandarte's intensive training and ideological indoctrination. The expansion would strain unit cohesion and dilute the elite culture that veterans considered essential to Leibstandarte identity. But it also reflected strategic reality. Germany's expanding wars required more divisions, and successful units like the Leibstandarte were expanded rather than replicated. Post-campaign rest in occupied Czechoslovakia provided brief respite before the Russian invasion. Soldiers billeted in Czech towns experienced something approaching normal life, sleeping in beds rather than vehicles, eating regular meals, receiving mail from home, even limited recreation time. Veterans of Poland, France, and now the Balkans recognized this as temporary peace, understanding that larger operations loomed. Conversations in barracks turned to speculation about where they would deploy next. Some soldiers hoped for occupation duty in France, others predicted operations in North Africa or the Middle East. A few correctly guessed Russia, but underestimated the scale of what was coming. Training continued at reduced intensity, focusing on integrating replacements and maintaining combat skills. Ideological lectures emphasized the coming struggle against Judeo-Bolshevism, preparing soldiers psychologically for the racial war that Nazi leadership planned for the East. The Balkans campaign's broader impact on the Leibstandarte's development was subtle but significant. They had demonstrated capability to conduct operations across diverse terrain, mountains, urban areas, river crossings, expanding their tactical repertoire beyond the mechanized warfare emphasized in France. They had learned that even elite troops could be stymied by prepared defences in favourable terrain, that tactical problems sometimes required ingenuity rather than aggression. They had begun developing the legendary reputation that would follow them throughout the war, though that reputation was built partially on exaggerated claims and appropriated achievements. Most significantly, they had experienced another campaign where atrocities remained limited, some prisoner executions, some rough treatment of civilians, but nothing approaching the systematic criminality of Poland. This created false impression that perhaps the worst was behind them, that the Leibstandarte could function as elite combat troops without descending into mass murder. Russia would shatter that illusion within weeks. Individual soldiers processed the Balkan experience through personal frameworks shaped by previous campaigns and ideological indoctrination. For some, the easy victory validated beliefs about German superiority and destiny to dominate inferior peoples. Others simply felt relief at surviving another campaign with minimal casualties, grateful for luck or skill that kept them alive while others died. A few recognized the campaign's fundamental pointlessness, a strategic distraction that delayed more important operations, conquered territory that provided no significant military advantage, and further stretched German forces across an expanding empire. But such strategic skepticism could not be voiced openly, particularly in the ideologically charged environment of SS units. Fritz Witt, whose battalion led the initial Yugoslav invasion, expressed private concerns in letters to his wife about the pace of expansion and the distances Germany's armies were covering. These letters suggest some Leibstandarte officers recognized gathering problems even as they followed orders and maintained public confidence. The spring of 1941 found the Leibstandarte at a crossroads, though few recognized it at the time. Behind them lay 3 successful campaigns that had expanded their reputation and validated their elite status. Ahead lay Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, which would transform them from effective combat troops into participants in genocide. The transition from the Balkans to Russia was not just geographical but moral, crossing a boundary between warfare governed by some restraints, however weak, into ideological war where restraints were explicitly rejected. The Leibstandarte's training, indoctrination, and previous experience had prepared them for this transition, though most soldiers did not understand what was coming. They knew they were Hitler's elite, that they wore the regime's most prestigious uniforms, that their oath demanded absolute obedience. What they did not know, or chose not to know, was that absolute obedience would soon mean participation in history's greatest crime. The road to genocide began not in Russia, but in the previous years of training and indoctrination, in the long knives executions and the Polish atrocities, in the Wormhout massacre and the 1,000 smaller crimes that normalized murder, Russia would simply reveal what the Leibstandarte had already become. June 22nd, 1941, 4 o'clock in the morning, the Soviet border near Lublin, Poland. An MG-42 machine gunner named Hans Becker, 19 years old, lies in tall grass watching the sun rise over the Soviet Union. He has been here for 6 hours, since midnight when his company moved into assault positions, waiting for the order to attack. Around him, 3 million German soldiers wait along an 1,800-kilometer front, the largest invasion force in history. Becker joined the Leibstandarte 6 months ago, a replacement filling vacancies from earlier campaigns, trained but untested in actual combat. The sergeant told him to keep his weapon clean, follow orders, and watch the soldier to his left. Everything else would make sense once the shooting started. The sergeant lied. At precisely 4:15, German artillery opens with a barrage that makes the earth tremble, thousands of guns firing simultaneously. 15 minutes later, whistles blow and Becker stands, advancing with his squad across the border into a country larger than he can comprehend, toward an enemy he has been taught to hate but does not understand, beginning a campaign that will consume his division and ultimately destroy Nazi Germany. He does not know any of this. He knows only that his machine gun weighs 14 kilograms and his throat is dry with fear. Operation Barbarossa began with German confidence bordering on arrogance. Intelligence assessments predicted Soviet military collapse within 8 to 10 weeks, arguing that Stalin's purges had destroyed the Red Army's officer corps and that Soviet equipment, organization, and morale were inferior to German standards. The Leibstandarte, attached to Army Group South's 1st Panzer Group, received objectives deep in Ukraine, Zhytomyr, Kiev, eventually the Dnieper River line. The initial advance matched predictions, covering hundreds of kilometers in days as Soviet frontier forces disintegrated under combined arms assault. Leibstandarte soldiers encountered abandoned Soviet positions, captured columns of confused prisoners, and advanced so rapidly that supply lines struggled to keep pace. This felt like Poland or France extended to continental scale, rapid breakthrough, collapsing enemy, victory through speed and shock. What soldiers did not initially recognize were warning signs that would later prove catastrophic. Soviet forces were retreating rather than surrendering in place, trading space for time rather than accepting encirclement, and conducting scorched earth destruction that would haunt German logistics throughout the campaign. The first encounter with 34 tanks near Zhytomyr on July 8th shattered German assumptions about Soviet technical inferiority. Leibstandarte anti-tank gunners fired at approaching Soviet armour with their 3.7 centimeter pack guns, standard anti-tank weapons effective against Polish and French tanks. The shells bounced off 34 frontal armour without penetrating, creating brilliant flashes but causing no damage. The Soviet tanks continued advancing, crushing anti-tank positions under their treads, firing 76mm guns that destroyed German vehicles with single shots. Leibstandarte infantry watched in horror as weapons they trusted proved useless, as German tanks were outgunned and out-armoured, as tactical doctrine developed against weaker opponents failed against this new enemy. The action was small-scale, a dozen 34s against a Leibstandarte battalion, and German forces ultimately prevailed through superior tactics and infantry anti-tank weapons. But the psychological impact was profound. For the first time, German soldiers faced enemy equipment superior to their own, demolishing the myth of German technical supremacy that underpinned operational confidence. The Battle of Uman in early August demonstrated both the Leibstandarte's tactical effectiveness and the horrifying scale of Barbarossa's combat. First, Panzer Group's encirclement trapped over 100,000 Soviet soldiers in a pocket near Uman, creating opportunities for Wehrmacht and SS units to cut off and destroy Soviet forces before they could escape. The Leibstandarte participated in closing the pocket, fighting through desperate Soviet breakout attempts. For 2 weeks, combat was continuous and brutal. Soviet forces attacked repeatedly to escape encirclement, while German forces struggled to contain them. The Leibstandarte lost hundreds of men killed and wounded in fighting that produced no dramatic breakthroughs, just grinding attrition as Soviet units were methodically destroyed. What shocked Leibstandarte soldiers was Soviet willingness to accept catastrophic casualties in exchange for minor tactical gains. Soviet infantry attacked German positions in waves, absorbing machine gun fire that killed hundreds while the survivors continued advancing. This was not the Wehrmacht's war of maneuver, but something older and darker, attrition warfare that consumed lives at rates that made World War I battles seem modest by comparison. The distances themselves became enemies. Leibstandarte vehicles covered 800 kilometers in the campaign's first 3 months. Distances that strained mechanical reliability, consumed fuel at unsustainable rates, and created logistics nightmares that no amount of planning had adequately addressed. Trucks broke down from overuse, requiring repair or abandonment. Spare parts became scarce, forcing mechanics to cannibalize damaged vehicles to keep others running. By September, approximately 60% of Leibstandarte vehicles were inoperable or severely degraded, reducing the division's mobility and creating traffic jams as operational vehicles waited for repair. The motorization that distinguished SS divisions from foot-mobile Wehrmacht infantry had become a liability mechanized units, immobilized by mechanical failure, while horse-drawn supply wagons, mocked as obsolete, continued functioning. This paradox would persist throughout the Russian campaign, with Germany's most modern forces repeatedly crippled by the very technology that supposedly made them superior. The Leibstandarte's participation in genocide began not as combat operations, but as deliberate murder separate from military necessity. In captured Ukrainian towns throughout July, August, and September 1941, Leibstandarte units cooperated with Einsatzgruppen SS death squads, tasked with murdering Jews, communist officials, and other designated enemies. The cooperation took various forms, providing security cordons while Einsatzgruppen conducted mass executions, supplying trucks for transporting victims to killing sites, occasionally participating directly in shootings. Photographs exist showing Leibstandarte soldiers watching executions, standing guard during massacres, even posing with victims' bodies. The justification provided was ideological. These were enemies of the Reich, dangerous partisans, racial threats requiring elimination. But the victims were overwhelmingly unarmed civilians, including women and children, murdered not for anything they had done, but for who they were. This was not war, but genocide, and the Leibstandarte's participation made them accomplices to history's greatest crime. Individual soldiers responded to genocide participation through psychological mechanisms that would later be extensively studied. Some enthusiastically embraced the killing, true believers in Nazi racial ideology who saw themselves executing necessary policy. Others participated mechanically, following orders without allowing themselves to think about moral implications, finding comfort in obedience rather than conscience. Many adopted psychological distance through euphemism and rationalization. Victims became enemies or elements, murder became special actions or cleansing operations, and personal responsibility dissolved into collective action where no individual felt accountable. A minority refused to participate directly, finding excuses to be elsewhere during massacres, but almost none formally objected or reported the crimes to higher authorities. The organizational culture punished dissent and rewarded compliance, making moral resistance psychologically costly and practically dangerous. This pattern repeated across all German units participating in genocide, but it had particular resonance for the Leibstandarte, whose identity was built on absolute loyalty to Hitler, and whose previous atrocities had established patterns that made escalation seem natural rather than shocking. The approach to Kiev in September represented the campaign's operational high point for German forces in the south. The Leibstandarte participated in the encirclement that trapped over 600,000 Soviet soldiers, the largest encirclement in military history. For Leibstandarte soldiers, the victory seemed to validate initial predictions about Soviet collapse. But the celebration was premature. The trapped Soviet forces fought desperately to escape, conducting attacks that inflicted heavy casualties on encircling German units. The Leibstandarte suffered hundreds more casualties containing an enemy already defeated strategically, a preview of how Soviet forces would continue fighting effectively even after tactical situations became hopeless. Moreover, The encirclement's success consumed time, weeks spent reducing the pocket rather than advancing deeper into Soviet territory. September became October, and soldiers who had crossed the border in summer uniforms began feeling autumn cold, wondering when winter uniforms would arrive, not yet understanding that supply failures would leave many without adequate winter clothing, even as temperatures dropped below freezing. The campaign's toll on the Leibstandarte by mid-September was staggering. 1,137 men killed, over 3,800 wounded, casualty rates approaching 30% in 3 months. This was not sustainable. At this attrition rate, the division would be destroyed as an effective fighting force within 6 months. Casualty rates among infantry companies were even worse, with some units suffering 50% losses. Entire platoons rebuilt multiple times as casualties mounted. The replacements arriving from Germany were less well trained than original division members, diluting combat effectiveness and unit cohesion. Veterans grew increasingly cynical about replacements, knowing many would die before learning basic survival skills, creating emotional distance that protected against grief, but also undermined the unit cohesion that sustained combat motivation. The Leibstandarte was still fighting effectively, but was slowly being bled to death, grinding toward destruction through successful operations that consumed irreplaceable human resources faster than they could be replaced. The distances also affected morale in ways that official reports never captured. Letters home, censored but still revealing, expressed growing bewilderment at Russia's vastness. Soldiers described covering hundreds of kilometers only to find more forest, more villages, more endless steppes stretching to horizons. The propaganda that promised quick victory now seemed laughable. Jokes circulated about marching to Vladivostok, darkly humorous acknowledgement that this campaign had no apparent end. Some soldiers maintained faith that German superiority would ultimately prevail, that Soviet collapse was merely delayed rather than impossible. Others grew quietly skeptical, wondering privately whether Germany had invaded something too large to conquer, whether victory was achievable, or whether they were simply marching deeper into a trap they did not understand. Such thoughts could not be expressed. Openly, defeatism was severely punished, but they percolated through whispered conversations and letters that hinted at concerns without stating them explicitly. Soviet partisan activity began appearing in September, small-scale initially but ominous in implication. Soviet soldiers who escaped encirclement disappeared into forests and swamps, forming armed bands that attacked German supply columns, ambushed isolated units, and sabotaged infrastructure. Leibstandarte units assigned to rear area security discovered that securing areas was impossible. Partisans attacked and melted away, leaving German forces unable to identify enemies among civilian populations. The standard German response was collective punishment. Villages near partisan attacks were burned, hostages executed, entire communities destroyed as warnings. The Leibstandarte participated enthusiastically in these reprisals, often exceeding even the brutal standards established by Wehrmacht security units. This created self-reinforcing cycles of violence. German atrocities drove more Soviets to join partisans, increasing attacks, justifying more atrocities. By war's end, partisan warfare would tie down hundreds of thousands of German troops desperately needed at the front, but in autumn 1941 the problem seemed manageable through sufficient brutality. The contrast between the Leibstandarte's operational success and strategic failure characterized the entire German invasion. Tactically, they remained effective, winning battles, destroying enemy formations, demonstrating combat skill that justified their elite status. But strategically, these victories accomplished nothing lasting. Territory captured was too vast to secure. Enemies defeated were replaced by fresh formations. Distances covered consumed resources faster than logistics could sustain. By late September 1941, the Leibstandarte had advanced over 800 kilometers into the Soviet Union, helped encircle hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers, and suffered casualties that would have destroyed lesser units. They were simultaneously succeeding and failing, demonstrating that tactical excellence without strategic coherence produced only elaborate forms of defeat. Hans Becker, the machine gunner who crossed the border in June, was dead by September, killed by a mortar shell near Kiev, one of thousands whose individual deaths composed the larger tragedy. His replacement, Another teenage recruit, named Klaus, would last 6 weeks before frostbite cost him 3 toes and medical evacuation back to Germany. The machine gun itself would remain in service, passed from one gunner to another as casualties mounted, an inanimate object outliving the men who served it. November 21st, 1941. Rostov-on-Don. SS Obersturmführer Paul Werner, platoon commander, stands in a snow-filled street watching his men clear buildings of Soviet resistance. They entered this city yesterday, after weeks of grinding advance, and for a few hours it felt like victory. A major city captured, strategic objectives achieved, headlines for propaganda purposes. But Werner knows something his soldiers don't yet understand. They are overextended, undersupplied, exhausted, and winter is coming with a fury that German planning never adequately considered. Temperatures have dropped to -10°C, and men are still wearing autumn uniforms because winter clothing remains somewhere in the logistics chain, stuck behind thousands of vehicles on roads turned to frozen mud. Soviet prisoners shuffle past in columns, and Werner notices they wear proper winter coats, felt boots, fur hats, equipment for conditions they knew were coming. His own men stamp their feet against the cold, wrap rags around their hands, and try to believe their commanders when told winter gear will arrive soon. It will not arrive soon. Many will be dead or crippled by frostbite before adequate clothing reaches on the front. Werner shivers and returns to his command post, wondering how long they can hold this city before the inevitable Soviet counterattack. Rostov's capture on November 21st represented the Leibstandarte's deepest penetration into Soviet territory during 1941. The city, sitting on the Don River, was strategically important as a gateway to the Caucasus oil fields and a major transportation hub. Its capture required 2 weeks of fighting through Soviet defensive positions, urban combat that consumed men and ammunition at horrifying rates. The Leibstandarte pushed forward with characteristic aggression, clearing streets building by building, losing soldiers to snipers and booby traps, gradually crushing Soviet resistance through superior tactics and firepower. When the swastika flag rose over the city centre, exhausted German soldiers celebrated briefly before collapsing into buildings for rest they desperately needed. Sepp Dietrich, commanding the division, sent triumphant reports to higher headquarters, carefully omitting details about casualties, supply shortages, and mounting frostbite cases. The victory was real, but hollow a city captured that could not be held, an advance that had reached its culminating point without achieving strategic objectives. The Soviet counterattack began on November 27th, 6 days after Rostov's capture. Fresh Siberian divisions, equipped for winter warfare and well supplied, struck the overextended German lines with overwhelming force. These were not the disorganized Soviet units of June, but professional troops with 34 tanks, coordinated artillery support, and operational doctrine learned from 3 months of disaster. The temperature dropped to -30°C as the offensive began, creating conditions where German vehicles would not start, weapons froze and jammed, and soldiers suffered frostbite injuries within minutes of exposure. The Leibstandarte found itself defending, with approximately 50% combat strength casualties, frostbite evacuations, and equipment failures having reduced each company to half its authorized men and vehicles. The Soviet attack did not attempt to bypass strong points, but simply crushed them through massed firepower and numerical superiority. German defensive positions that would have held in France crumbled in hours when defenders were too cold to aim properly and too exhausted to maintain alertness. Sepp Dietrich faced a decision no German commander wanted to make: hold Rostov and risk encirclement and destruction, or retreat without permission and face Hitler's wrath. Wehrmacht doctrine allowed tactical withdrawals when operational necessity demanded, but the Leibstandarte answered to SS command structure, ultimately to Hitler personally, and the Führer had issued explicit orders prohibiting retreat. Dietrich chose survival over obedience. On November 29th, he ordered the Leibstandarte to withdraw from Rostov, abandoning the city they had bled to capture. This was the first time in the Leibstandarte's history they had retreated from an enemy, a psychological blow that no amount of rationalizing could disguise. Veterans who had never questioned German superiority now faced the undeniable reality that Soviet forces could not only resist but attack successfully, forcing Germany's elite formation to abandon positions and flee. The retreat was conducted with reasonable discipline units covering each other, equipment destroyed rather than captured, but it was still retreat, still defeat, still evidence that German invincibility was mythology rather than fact. The withdrawal through snow and cold was horror that survivors remembered for the rest of their lives. Leibstandarte units retreated on foot, abandoning vehicles that would not start or had no fuel, carrying wounded soldiers who would freeze if left behind. Frostbite became epidemic. Men lost toes, fingers, noses, ears to cold. That exceeded anything German planning had considered. Soldiers wrapped their feet in rags, torn from dead men's clothing, wore Soviet coats stripped from prisoners or corpses, huddled together for warmth during brief rest stops. Soviet forces pursued aggressively, attacking whenever Germans paused, preventing rest or reorganization. The withdrawal covered over 100 kilometers in temperatures that regularly dropped below -35°C, with soldiers marching through snowstorms that reduced visibility to meters, following the men in front through white emptiness that seemed to have no end. Some soldiers simply stopped walking, sat in the snow, and waited to freeze, a form of suicide that required no conscious decision, just cessation of will. Hitler's response to Dietrich's unauthorized retreat was characteristically contradictory. The Führer summoned Dietrich to Berlin, intending to court-martial him for disobedience. But after a personal meeting where Dietrich explained the tactical situation and the division's casualties, Hitler forgave him, recognizing that punishing his personal bodyguard's commander would create problems larger than the offense. Instead, Hitler issued orders prohibiting future retreats, creating operational inflexibility that would later prove catastrophic. Wehrmacht commanders watched this episode with bitter amusement. Dietrich violated orders and received forgiveness because of his personal relationship with Hitler, while army generals who made similar tactical decisions faced relief of command. The incident reinforced perceptions that SS units operated under different rules, that political loyalty trumped military competence, and that the Führer's favourites received protection that professional soldiers could not expect. These perceptions were entirely accurate. The division's condition by mid-December 1941 was catastrophic. 394 killed in the Rostov fighting and retreat, 1,200 wounded, and over 800 severe frostbite cases, requiring medical evacuation. Approximately 25% total casualties in 3 weeks. Equipment losses were equally severe. 150 vehicles destroyed or abandoned. Most heavy weapons lost. Winter clothing still not distributed to surviving troops. The Leibstandarte as an effective combat formation had essentially ceased to exist, reduced to battalion-strength remnants holding defensive positions near Taganrog and desperately trying to prevent further Soviet advances. Replacements were promised but would require months to arrive and integrate. The division that crossed the Soviet border in June with 10,000 combat troops now fielded fewer than 5,000 effective soldiers, and many of those were partially disabled by frostbite, exhaustion, or minor wounds that would have justified evacuation in earlier campaigns but now couldn't be spared from the line. The psychological impact of the winter crisis exceeded its tactical significance. Leibstandarte soldiers had believed themselves superior to ordinary troops, elite warriors whose training and ideology guaranteed victory. Rostov demolished that belief. They had retreated, defeated not primarily by enemy action, but by weather and logistics mundane failures that suggested German preparation had been catastrophically inadequate. The propaganda about German superiority and Soviet inferiority now seemed like cruel jokes told by leaders who did not understand reality. Trust in higher command eroded, with soldiers recognizing that their commanders had sent them into Russia without adequate equipment, realistic logistics planning, or honest assessment of enemy capabilities. This erosion of trust never produced mutiny, organizational culture, and fear of punishment maintained discipline, but it created cynicism that would persist throughout the war, a private understanding among combat troops that their leaders were either incompetent or dishonest, and possibly both. Individual survival stories from the winter revealed both human resilience and moral collapse under extreme stress. Soldiers who would have died protecting wounded comrades in France now abandoned injured men because carrying them meant freezing themselves. Men stole food from each other, hoarded supplies, lied about equipment status to avoid dangerous assignments. The unit cohesion that sustained combat effectiveness frayed under conditions where survival required selfishness. Yet paradoxically, many soldiers also demonstrated extraordinary courage and self-sacrifice, medics treating wounded despite frostbitten hands, platoon leaders staying alert on watch despite exhaustion, soldiers sharing their last food with weaker comrades. This contradictory behavior, sometimes selfless, sometimes sociopathic, reflected the fact that humans under extreme stress do not become consistently noble or consistently base, but oscillate between extremes, depending on immediate circumstances and personal character. The Leibstandarte in winter 1941 contained both heroes and criminals, sometimes the same individuals in different moments. The relief of finally receiving winter clothing in January 1942 came too late for hundreds of soldiers already crippled by frostbite. The winter coats, felt boots, and fur hats that arrived in early 1942 were exactly what should have been issued in October. Soldiers who received them felt simultaneous relief and rage. Relief at finally having proper equipment, rage at the incompetence or indifference that caused months of preventable suffering. Many wounded soldiers evacuated to Germany required amputations, toes, fingers, entire feet or hands destroyed by frostbite that would have been prevented by adequate clothing. These casualties did not appear in combat loss statistics but represented permanent disability caused directly by supply failures. Some amputees would eventually return to combat in support roles. Most were medically discharged. Their military careers ended not by enemy action but by bureaucratic failure. The irony was bitter and not lost on the soldiers who survived intact. They had been defeated as much by German logistics as by Soviet arms. The winter of 1941 to 42 transformed the Leibstandarte from confident elite troops to survivors of catastrophe who understood that victory was no longer assured, or perhaps even possible. They had crossed an invisible threshold from offensive to defensive war, from advancing armies to embattled forces struggling to maintain positions. The strategic initiative had passed to the Soviet Union, which had absorbed catastrophic losses but remained a functioning military power, while Germany had expended irreplaceable resources for gains that could not be sustained. The Leibstandarte would recover, receive replacements, rebuild its strength, and return to offensive operations in 1942. But the soldiers who survived the winter carried knowledge that could not be erased. They were not invincible, their enemy would not collapse, and this war would be won only if German forces could sustain attrition rates that were already stretching national capacity to its limits. Paul Werner, the platoon commander who watched his men enter Rostov, survived the winter with 9 of his original 40 soldiers. The others were dead, permanently disabled, or posted missing, a category that usually meant dead but without recovered bodies. Werner received a replacement platoon in February, trained them through spring, and led them back into combat in summer 1942. None of the replacements lasted 3 months. Werner himself died at Kursk in July 1943, shot through the chest during an attack that gained 200 meters of meaningless terrain. The machine gun from his platoon survived him, passed to another unit, continuing to function long after the men who served it had been consumed. February 1942. A rail yard in Normandy, France. SS Hauptsturmführer Michael Scholz, maintenance officer, watches trains arrive carrying the remnants of the Leibstandarte division, returning from the Russian nightmare. Men descend from boxcars moving like old people, though most are under 25. Stiff, slow, damaged. Many still wrap their feet in rags because frostbite destroyed their toes, and regulation boots no longer fit. Some are missing fingers, ears, noses, pieces of themselves surrendered to Russian cold. Their uniforms are mismatched collections of German, Soviet, and improvised clothing, more like scarecrows than elite soldiers. Scholz had spent the winter in France organizing the division's rebuilding, requisitioning equipment, preparing facilities, and coordinating with SS training establishments. He knew casualties had been severe, but seeing the broken men emerging from trains drives home the magnitude of what happened this is not a division but fragments of one, survivors who should be grateful to be alive but look more traumatized than relieved. His mission is to rebuild these fragments into the fighting force that crossed into Russia 9 months ago. Looking at the hollow-eyed veterans, Schultz wonders if that's even possible. The decision to withdraw the Leibstandarte from Russia for rebuilding reflected both their value to the regime and their catastrophic condition. By January 1942, the division could barely field battalion-strength combat power, with most units at 25 to 30% authorized strength. Hitler personally ordered the withdrawal, recognizing that the Leibstandarte's propaganda value required restoring them to effectiveness. The division travelled by rail to Normandy, selected for its distance from active fighting, mild climate compared to Russia, and proximity to SS training facilities and equipment depots. The rebuilding program would require 6 months, transforming the shattered infantry division into a Panzer Grenadier division with attached tank battalion, upgrading their capabilities while replacing losses. This represented enormous resource investment in a single division, creating resentment from Wehrmacht units that received minimal replacements while SS formations enjoyed priority. But for the Nazi regime, the Leibstandarte was not just another division but a symbol whose destruction would constitute ideological defeat as serious as military loss. Replacement troops began arriving in March, filling the vast gaps in the division's ranks. The new soldiers differed significantly from the original Leibstandarte volunteers. Height requirements had been progressively relaxed, racial purity standards somewhat loosened, age ranges expanded. Many were 17 or 18 years old. Hitler Youth members who had absorbed Nazi ideology from childhood and volunteered eagerly for SS service. Others were conscripts assigned to the Waffen-SS as Germany's personnel needs exceeded volunteer availability. The ideological commitment varied. Some were fanatical Nazis who genuinely believed in racial war and German destiny. Others simply wanted to join an elite formation. Still others had no strong feelings but accepted assignment because refusal was not an option. This ideological diversity would gradually erode the Leibstandarte's character as a committed Nazi formation, though that erosion would take years and never completely eliminate the ideological core that shaped the division's identity. The integration of veterans and replacements created interesting social dynamics within the rebuilding division. Veterans, recognizing that survival required knowledge that could not be taught in training, took upon themselves the education of replacements. They conducted informal instruction in survival techniques, how to dig effective foxholes, identify the sound of incoming artillery, move under fire, treat wounded comrades, conserve ammunition, stay alert during long watches. This practical knowledge, transmitted from survivor to novice, was far more valuable than anything learned in training establishments. But veterans also transmitted attitudes: cynicism about higher command, contempt for propaganda that contradicted experienced reality, ruthlessness toward enemies and civilians. The new soldiers absorbed both practical skills and moral corruption from teachers who had survived by learning when to discard conscience. This informal education created continuity between the division's criminal past and its future atrocities. The arrival of tanks transformed the Leibstandarte from infantry to Panzer Grenadier division, fundamentally changing their tactical identity. Starting in April 1942, Panzer Mark IVs arrived, 75mm main guns, respectable armour, adequate mobility. By June, the division possessed 104 tanks, including 6. Tiger is Germany's newest heavy tank with 88mm gun and armour that could withstand most Soviet anti-tank weapons. The Tigers were prestigious machines, symbols of German technical prowess, and their assignment to the Leibstandarte reflected both political favouritism and recognition that elite formations required elite equipment. But tanks also meant new training requirements, crew coordination, mechanical maintenance, tactical employment. Infantry soldiers had to learn how to work with tanks rather than simply following behind them. This created temporary confusion and friction, but ultimately produced a more capable combined arms force that could integrate infantry, armour, artillery, and engineers more effectively than the purely infantry division that had entered Russia. Kurt Meyer emerged as a central figure during the rebuilding period. demonstrating the leadership capabilities that would later make him division commander. Now, SS Sturmbannführer, commanding a battalion. Meyer emphasized aggressive tactics and rapid exploitation of breakthroughs, the Panzer Wedge doctrine that German armor theorists had developed but few units executed well. Meyer's training exercises emphasized speed over caution, shock over attrition, maintaining momentum even at risk of overextension. His methods produced higher training casualties than Wehrmacht standards permitted, but they also created units capable of executing the lightning attacks that characterized German armor doctrine at its best. Meyer's personality: charismatic, profane, demanding, personally brave, earned loyalty from subordinates who would follow him into extraordinarily dangerous situations. He represented the Leibstandarte's ideal. Tactically brilliant, ideologically committed, morally flexible enough to commit any atrocity if operationally useful. The ideological indoctrination intensified during the rebuilding period, particularly for younger replacements. SS education officers conducted daily political lectures emphasizing racial struggle, Bolshevik Jewish conspiracy theories, and the existential nature of the Eastern Front War. Films showed exaggerated or fabricated Soviet atrocities, creating desire for revenge. Literature portrayed Germans as defending Western civilization against Asiatic hordes. This indoctrination served multiple purposes. It motivated soldiers to fight aggressively, justified atrocities as necessary measures in racial war, and created psychological distance between Germans and their enemies that made killing emotionally easier. Some soldiers absorbed this ideology completely, becoming true believers who required no orders to commit atrocities. Others accepted it superficially, finding it useful justification for actions they performed for other reasons. A minority privately rejected the ideology but outwardly conformed, recognizing that dissent was dangerous and ultimately futile. All was shaped by constant immersion in propaganda that normalized violence and dehumanized enemies. The 6-month rebuilding period allowed for tactical and doctrinal improvements based on Russian campaign lessons. The division adopted new radio procedures that maintained communication under stress, developed better coordination protocols between infantry and armour, improved supply distribution systems, and revised tactical manuals to reflect actual combat experience rather than peacetime theory. These changes made the rebuilt Leibstandarte significantly more effective than the division that entered Russia. But the improvements were tactical rather than strategic. Better, small unit operations could not compensate for Germany's fundamental strategic problems, including manpower shortages, industrial inferiority to Allied coalition, and inability to achieve decisive victory despite tactical successes. The Leibstandarte was being transformed into a more lethal instrument for prosecuting an ultimately unwinnable war. By June 1942, the Leibstandarte had reached full strength, 21,000 men, fully equipped, trained, and eager to return to combat. The transformation was remarkable. The shattered remnants that arrived in February had been rebuilt into what was arguably Germany's most capable division. Equipment levels exceeded Wehrmacht standards, training had been intensive and comprehensive, morale appeared high despite veterans' private cynicism. Final readiness inspections in June showed a division that met or exceeded every operational metric. SS leadership was satisfied, having demonstrated their ability to rebuild elite formations. Wehrmacht observers remained skeptical, noting that equipment and training meant nothing until tested in actual combat, that Russia had a way of destroying even the best units, and that rebuilding divisions required resources that Germany was running short of as the war expanded. Both perspectives contained truth. The Leibstandarte was indeed a formidable combat formation, but formidable divisions could still be destroyed if employed in strategically hopeless situations. The division's departure for Russia in late June 1942 began another cycle of advance, attrition, temporary victory, and eventual crisis. Soldiers who had survived the previous winter understood what was coming better than replacements who saw only the adventure and glory. Veterans packed extra clothing, hoarded supplies, maintained equipment obsessively, and said private goodbyes that acknowledged they might not return. Replacements treated deployment as exciting opportunity, eager to prove themselves, confident in German superiority. This divide between realistic veterans and naive replacements characterized all combat units, but was particularly sharp in formations like the Leibstandarte, where casualty rates were extraordinarily high. Train cars carrying the division east past trains carrying wounded west, a constant circulation of men from Germany to Russia, to hospital and back, a human conveyor belt feeding the Eastern Front's insatiable appetite for soldiers. Michael Schultz, the maintenance officer who watched broken men arrive in February, now watched fully equipped troops depart in June. He had succeeded in his rebuilding mission but felt no satisfaction, knowing that most of these men would be dead or wounded within a year, and the cycle would begin again. This time he would be going with them. His bureaucratic safety had ended with the completion of rebuilding, and he would now serve as battalion operations officer, trading paperwork for combat. He died in March 1943 near Kharkov, killed by a Soviet artillery shell that left no identifiable remains. His name appears on a memorial to missing soldiers, one of thousands whose deaths were recorded but whose bodies were never found. February 19, 1943, near Krasnograd, Ukraine. SS Untersturmführer Heinrich Krauss sits in his Tiger tanks, commander's hatch, watching the eastern horizon for signs of Soviet armor. The tank rumbles beneath him, 88mm gun pointing toward expected enemy approach routes. This is the third day of Manstein's counter-offensive, the calculated gamble that might restore German fortunes after Stalingrad's disaster, or might simply throw away Germany's last reserves in futile gesture. Krauss commanded a Panzer Mark IV during summer 1942 operations, learned tank warfare through survival, and received promotion to Tiger Commander in January. The Tiger is magnificent and problematic. Its armor resists anything. Soviets fire at it. Its gun destroys enemy tanks at ranges where return fire is impossible, but it breaks down constantly and consumes fuel at rates that keep supply officers awake at night. The Tiger next to his threw a track yesterday, now sits disabled, waiting for repair. The Tiger behind him has engine problems, operating at reduced capacity. Of 12 Tigers in his company, only 7 are fully operational. Still, 7 Tigers equal perhaps 30 or 40 34s in combat power. If Soviet armor appears, Krauss's job is simple. Destroy them before they close to ranges where numerical superiority matters. The wait continues. In the distance, artillery thunder suggests contact elsewhere along the line. The Third Battle of Kharkov began with strategic desperation masked as operational brilliance. The Wehrmacht had surrendered Kharkov on February 15th, withdrawing before Soviet offensive pressure, trading space for time while conserving forces. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, commanding Army Group South, planned a counter-offensive using mobile reserves, including the Leibstandarte and other SS divisions, to strike overextended Soviet spearheads. The concept was classic mobile warfare: allow enemy to advance, stretch their supply lines, then strike flanks and rear with concentrated armor. The Leibstandarte, rebuilt and re-equipped, was Manstein's most capable formation, assigned the most difficult mission breakthrough and exploitation regardless of opposition. For soldiers who retreated from Rostov in shame 15 months earlier, this was opportunity for redemption, chance to prove the winter defeat was temporary setback rather than permanent condition. The initial assault on February 19th exceeded even optimistic projections. Leibstandarte Tigers and Panzer IVs smashed through Soviet defensive positions near Krasnograd, destroying dozens of enemy tanks, overrunning artillery positions, creating chaos in Soviet rear areas. The combination of Tiger tanks' invulnerability and tactical coordination developed during French training proved devastating against Soviet forces still learning combined arms warfare. Soviet 34s burned on frozen fields, their crews killed or fleeing, while Leibstandarte panzers advanced with minimal losses. Infantry followed in half-tracks, exploiting breakthroughs, clearing strongpoints that might threaten tanks' flanks. This was Blitzkrieg resurrected, not the fantasy version from propaganda, but the reality of what elite troops with good equipment and surprise could accomplish against competent but unprepared enemies. The death ride, as Leibstandarte soldiers later called the 72-hour advance from February 19th through 21st, demonstrated both peak performance and terrible cost. The division advanced over 100 kilometers in 3 days, fighting continuously, pausing only for refueling and rearming. Crews stayed in vehicles for days, sleeping in commanders' hatches, eating cold rations on the move, urinating into empty shell casings because dismounting wasted time. Infantry rode in open half-tracks through temperatures below freezing, exposed to wind and occasional Soviet fire, enduring conditions that would have been considered intolerable in peacetime, but now seemed merely normal wartime discomfort. The advance cut through Soviet positions like a scalpel, severing communications, destroying headquarters units, creating panic among Soviet forces that had grown accustomed to advancing rather than retreating. For 3 days, the Leibstandarte was unstoppable, recapturing terrain surrendered weeks earlier, validating their elite status, providing propaganda victories that regime desperately needed after Stalingrad's catastrophe. The street fighting for Kharkov itself began on March 11th, transforming the operation from mobile warfare to urban combat, where the Leibstandarte's advantages diminished. Soviet forces defending the city included experienced troops with strong defensive positions, artillery support, and orders to hold at any cost. Tigers proved less valuable in cities, their size made them vulnerable in narrow streets, their fuel consumption meant they could not operate continuously, their mechanical reliability problems intensified under urban combat stress. Panzer Grenadiers fought building to building, clearing Soviet strongpoints through tactics learned at Stalingrad's cost elsewhere. The fighting was close range and brutal grenades through windows, machine guns at room-clearing distances, flamethrowers burning defenders from fortified positions, casualties mounted as the Leibstandarte ground through defensive positions, but Soviet resistance gradually collapsed under sustained pressure and casualties they could not replace quickly enough. The recapture of Kharkov city centre on March 15th represented the operation's symbolic climax. Leibstandarte troops raised the swastika flag over Red Square, the city's central plaza, while Sepp Dietrich personally observed from a nearby building. The moment was photographed, filmed, and distributed through propaganda channels as evidence that German armies had recovered from winter defeats and remained capable of decisive victory. Hitler was delighted, praising the Leibstandarte as exemplars of National Socialist fighting spirit. Wehrmacht generals were more measured, recognizing the operation's tactical brilliance but noting its limited strategic impact. Kharkov was recaptured, but German forces remained weaker than before the winter campaign. Soviet reserves remained vast, and the temporary victory could not change fundamental strategic realities. Still, the propaganda value was real, and soldiers who participated felt justified pride in having accomplished something genuinely difficult against a competent enemy. The battles cost 167 Leibstandarte killed, over 800 wounded, seemed modest compared to achievements but represented losses that could not be sustained indefinitely. The division had been at full strength when the offensive began. It ended approximately 10% below strength. More concerning was equipment attrition. 24 tanks total losses, another 40 damaged and requiring repair. The Tigers that had seemed invincible at the Poznan offensive's beginning were demonstrating chronic mechanical problems, final drives failing, transmissions breaking, engines overheating. At any given time, approximately 30% of Tigers were inoperational, awaiting parts or major repairs that strained division maintenance capabilities. This created paradox that would plague German armour throughout the war. The most powerful tanks were also the least reliable, creating situations where technological superiority was undermined by mechanical fragility. Individual soldier experiences during the battle revealed the psychological complexity of combat effectiveness coexisting with criminality. Many Leibstandarte soldiers fought with extraordinary courage and tactical skill, behaviours that any military would recognise as exemplary. They also committed war crimes, executing Soviet prisoners, murdering civilians suspected of partisan activity, deliberately targeting medical personnel. These behaviours were not contradictory but complementary aspects of the same organisational culture that valued results over restraints. A Tiger commander might destroy 5 Soviet tanks through brilliant gunnery in the morning. Then machine gun surrendering Soviet tankers in the afternoon, both actions flowing from the same mindset that saw enemies as obstacles to eliminate, rather than humans deserving protection under laws of war. The Leibstandarte's tactical excellence was inseparable from its criminality, because both emerged from institutional culture that recognized no limits on violence in pursuit of objectives. The operation's conclusion in late March brought strategic pause rather than continued offensive. German forces had recaptured Kharkov and stabilized the front, but they lacked resources to exploit success further. The spring Rasputitsa muddy season, when Russia's unpaved roads became impassable, was beginning, making mobile operations impossible. Both German and Soviet forces used the pause to rebuild, replace losses, and prepare for summer operations. The Leibstandarte received replacements, repaired damaged equipment, and conducted training to integrate new soldiers. Veterans who survived the battle were promoted to fill vacancies from casualties, creating organizational churning where soldiers moved constantly between positions as combat, attrition, and expansion created simultaneous shortages and requirements. This organizational instability undermined unit cohesion, but was unavoidable given casualty rates and force expansion that characterized the Eastern Front War. The Third Battle of Kharkov represented the Leibstandarte's operational pinnacle, the moment when they were most effective relative to their enemy, when their tactical skills and equipment advantages produced decisive results, when their reputation for elite performance was most justified. Everything after Kharkov would be decline, whether rapid or gradual, obvious or disguised. The strategic initiative was passing permanently to the Soviet Union, which was learning combined arms warfare while expanding production to levels Germany could not match. The Leibstandarte would continue fighting effectively, would achieve tactical victories, would maintain reputation for ferocity and skill, but they would never again operate from strategic advantage, never again face enemies less competent than themselves, never again achieve victories that changed campaign trajectories rather than merely delaying defeat. Heinrich Krauss, the Tiger commander who began the battle watching empty horizons, ended it with 4 Soviet tank kills marked on his gun barrel, a promotion to SS Obersturmführer, and frostbite in 3 toes from hours spent in an open hatch. He would command Tigers through the summer offensive at Kursk, survive that battle, and die in Normandy in June 1944 when an American tank destroyer ambushed his platoon. The Tiger he commanded at Kharkov was destroyed near Prokhorovka in July 1943, total loss after engine fire. Its replacement Tiger lasted 3 weeks before transmission failure. The third Tiger assigned to his position survived longer than Krauss did, serving through mid-1944 before final destruction in Normandy. The machines, with sufficient maintenance and replacement parts, could last longer than the men who operated them, a reversal of normal relationships where humans outlived their tools. July 5th, 1943. 3 o'clock in the morning. SS Standartenführer Joachim Paper, 38 years old, regimental commander, stands outside his command half-track near Belgorod, watching the sky lighten with false dawn. Around him, the largest concentration of German armour ever assembled waits for attack orders, over 2,700 tanks and assault guns, including 131 Tigers and 200 Ferdinands, all aimed at a 60-kilometre sector of Soviet defensive lines. The Leibstandarte Division occupies positions in the southern pincer of Operation Citadel, Hitler's last offensive gamble in Russia, the attack that will either restore German initiative or consume Germany's armoured reserves in fruitless assault against prepared defences. Piper has studied aerial photographs showing Soviet positions, multiple defensive belts, minefields extending kilometres in depth, anti-tank ditches, prepared artillery positions. The Soviets know this attack is coming, have had months to prepare, have transformed the Kursk salient into the most heavily fortified region in military history. German intelligence estimates 4,000 anti-tank mines per kilometre of front line, layered defences 6 positions deep, artillery density exceeding anything seen in previous campaigns. Paper's mission is simple and impossible. Break through regardless of opposition, advance 40 kilometres by day's end, maintain momentum until Soviet defences collapse. He knows the mission is unrealistic, but also knows that expressing doubt means relief from command. At 3:15, German artillery opens with barrage that lights the horizon orange. 45 minutes later, Peiper's regiment crosses the start line into hell. Operation Citadel represented strategic desperation disguised as offensive capability. After Kharkov's recapture, German High Command recognized that summer 1943 offered last opportunity for major offensive before Soviet quantitative superiority became overwhelming. The Kursk salient, a Soviet-held bulge in German lines, was obvious target, vulnerable to double envelopment from north and south. But the offensive was delayed repeatedly while Germany fielded new weapons, Panthers, Tigers, Ferdinands, and the delays gave Soviets months to prepare. Soviet forces constructed 6 defensive belts, with combined depth exceeding 150 kilometers, laid over 650,000 mines, positioned over 20,000 guns and mortars, and assembled reserves that dwarfed German attacking forces. Soviet commanders understood German intentions through intelligence and simple military logic. The salient was obvious target, the timing predictable. They transformed obvious vulnerability into prepared killing ground, then waited for Germans to attack into it. The Leibstandarte advanced as part of SS Panzer Corps, alongside Das Reich and Totenkopf divisions, forming the most powerful German formation on the Eastern Front. The Corps possessed over 600 tanks, including substantial numbers of Tigers, supported by concentrated artillery and Luftwaffe close air support. The initial attack on July 5th broke through 1st Soviet defensive belt through combination of firepower, armor, protection, and tactical skill. Tigers destroyed Soviet anti-tank positions from ranges where return fire was ineffective. Panthers and Panzer IVs exploited gaps. Panzer Grenadiers followed to clear strongpoints and secure gains. But each kilometer advance was contested, each defensive position cost casualties before falling, and Soviet reserves counterattacked continuously to slow German momentum. The advance that was supposed to cover 40 kilometers in one day gained 8 kilometers at cost of substantial casualties and mechanical breakdowns that reduced operational tank strength by approximately 20%. The next week became grinding attrition warfare disguised as mobile operations. The Leibstandarte attacked daily, gained several kilometers each day, destroyed substantial Soviet equipment, and suffered steady casualties from mines, artillery, anti-tank guns, and Soviet counterattacks. The pattern was numbingly repetitive. Artillery preparation, tank advance into known minefields because bypass routes were blocked or non-existent, engineer teams clearing paths under fire, Soviet anti-tank guns engaging at close range, infantry fighting for each defensive position, temporary success, then Soviet reinforcements counterattacking and forcing defensive operations that consumed time and lives. German tactics remained effective. Leibstandarte units destroyed far more Soviet equipment than they lost. Casualty ratios favoured Germans. Tactical engagements were often German victories. But the strategic arithmetic was crushing. Germans could not afford their losses, while Soviets could replace theirs. German advance consumed irreplaceable resources for gains that had no strategic value, and time worked entirely in Soviet favour. The tank battle near Prokhorovka on July 12th became legendary through Soviet propaganda and German defensive claims, though reality was more complex than either narrative. The Leibstandarte was actually fighting north of Prokhorovka rather than in the famous field where Soviet and German armour supposedly engaged in largest tank battle of history. Their actual experience was less dramatic but more representative of the operation's character. Slow, advanced through prepared defences, continuous Soviet counterattacks, steady attrition of German tank strength through combination of combat losses and mechanical failures. By July 12th, the Leibstandarte had advanced approximately 30 kilometers from their start positions, impressive by Eastern Front standards, but far short of operational objectives that required breakthrough and exploitation. More critically, the division had suffered 261 killed and 1,800 wounded, lost 11 tanks as total write-offs and another 40 damaged, and saw their combat effectiveness degraded through exhaustion as much as casualties. Hitler's decision to terminate Operation Citadel on July 13th, citing need to transfer units to Italy after Allied invasion of Sicily, came as relief to soldiers who recognized the offensive had failed strategically even while achieving tactical successes. The Leibstandarte had penetrated deeper than most German units, destroyed substantial Soviet equipment, demonstrated continued combat effectiveness, but none of it mattered strategically. Soviet defenses had absorbed the German assault without collapsing. Red Army reserves remained substantial, and within days, Soviet forces launched their own offensives that would drive Germans back beyond their start positions. The strategic initiative on the Eastern Front passed permanently to the Soviet Union on July 13th, 1943. Every subsequent German operation would be defensive, reactive, attempting to delay inevitable defeat rather than achieve victory. The Leibstandarte would continue fighting with skill and determination, would achieve tactical successes, would demonstrate that elite troops remained dangerous opponents, but they would never again attack with confidence that victory was achievable through operational brilliance. The immediate aftermath saw the Leibstandarte committed to defensive operations against Soviet counteroffensives, fighting withdrawal battles that consumed more casualties while gaining nothing except time. The pattern established at Kursk would continue for the rest of the war. German forces fought skillfully at tactical level, achieved favourable casualty ratios, demonstrated professional competence, and lost strategically because tactical success could not overcome fundamental disadvantages in manpower, production, and strategic position. For Leibstandarte soldiers, the transition from offensive to defensive warfare was psychologically difficult. Attacking, even with heavy casualties, felt purposeful and aggressive. Defense felt like slow defeat, trading lives for kilometers of meaningless terrain, watching the same ground be captured and recaptured repeatedly without any sense that progress was being achieved. Individual soldiers processed the battle's implications through various psychological frameworks. True believers maintained faith that German genius would somehow produce victory despite material disadvantages, that new weapons or strategic brilliance would change fundamental realities. Pragmatists recognized the war was likely lost but continued fighting from professional pride, loyalty to comrades, or simple inability to imagine alternatives to obeying orders. A minority grew privately despairing, seeing no path to victory but unable to escape or desert without risking execution and family punishment. Letters home, heavily censored, could not express actual conditions or true assessments, forcing soldiers to maintain pretense that everything was fine, that victory remained achievable, that their sacrifices were meaningful. This disconnect between experienced reality and expressible narrative created psychological isolation, with soldiers living in a world of horrors that could not be shared with families or acknowledged openly even among themselves. The Leibstandarte's post-Kursk casualty reports revealed the operation's grinding cost, 261 dead, represented approximately 2% of division strength, seemingly modest. But the 1,800 wounded represented over 15%. And many wounded would never return to combat or would return with reduced capability. Tank losses seemed sustainable, 11 total losses from 131 starting strength, but the 40 damaged tanks included vehicles requiring major repairs that would take weeks or months. Crew losses were proportionally higher than tank losses because destroyed tanks often killed entire crews, while damaged tanks wounded crews without destroying vehicles. This created a paradoxical situation where tank replacement was often easier than finding trained crews to operate them. The division remained combat capable after Kursk but was weaker than before, and unlike earlier campaigns, there would be no months-long rebuilding period in France or Germany. The next battle would come immediately, then another, in relentless cycle that ground down even elite formations through simple attrition. Joachim Peiper, who led his regiment into Kursk's opening attack, survived the battle with minor wounds, shell fragments in his shoulder, treated and remaining with his unit. He was unusual among senior Leibstandarte officers in combining tactical brilliance with ideological fanaticism and willingness to commit atrocities personally. His command style emphasized aggressive action, rapid exploitation, and ruthless treatment of enemies and civilians. Subordinates admired his courage and tactical skill while privately fearing his volatility and moral flexibility. Piper would command increasingly important formations through the war's final 2 years, achieving tactical brilliance during the Ardennes offensive while simultaneously orchestrating the Malmedy massacre. His career exemplified the Leibstandarte's dual nature: genuine military capability, coexisting with systematic criminality; tactical excellence, serving ideologically driven barbarism. He died in 1976, murdered by unknown assailants in France who likely targeted him for war crimes. The mystery of his death, whether political assassination, criminal revenge, or random violence, was never solved, leaving a fitting ambiguity for a man whose military brilliance was inseparable from moral monstrosity. August 19th, 1943. A destroyed bridge over the Mias River, southern Ukraine. SS Obersturmführer Franz Becker, medical officer, kneels beside a wounded panzer grenadier whose legs have been shredded by Soviet artillery. The man is 19 years old, screaming for his mother, bleeding out faster than Becker can control. Around them, the Leibstandarte conducts another fighting withdrawal, trading lives for kilometers, delaying Soviet advance while Wehrmacht units escape encirclement. This is Becker's fourth such withdrawal in 6 weeks since Kursk ended. Each time, the pattern repeats: establish defensive positions, fight until Soviet pressure becomes overwhelming, retreat to the next river or ridgeline, repeat until exhaustion makes the process mechanical rather than conscious. The retreat from Kursk to the Dnieper River consumed the late summer and autumn of 1943, covering over 500 kilometers through continuous combat. Soviet forces, having broken German offensive at Kursk, immediately launched their own operations across multiple fronts, exploiting German weakness and forcing general withdrawal. The Leibstandarte fought as rearguard repeatedly, assigned to hold critical positions while army units withdrew, then leapfrogging back to new positions. This was the role elite units played in retreat, sacrificing themselves to preserve less capable formations, accepting disproportionate casualties, because they could still fight effectively under conditions that would shatter ordinary units. The continuous combat allowed no rest, no recovery, no opportunity to integrate replacements or repair equipment adequately. The fighting near Belgorod in August demonstrated both the Leibstandarte's continued effectiveness and the futility of tactical success without strategic advantage. Soviet forces attacked with massive numerical superiority, accepting horrific casualties to maintain offensive momentum. Leibstandarte defensive positions destroyed dozens of Soviet tanks, killed hundreds of Soviet infantry, maintained tactical cohesion under pressure that collapsed lesser units. But the Soviets simply brought forward more tanks, more infantry, more artillery, grinding through German defenses through sheer material superiority. After 3 days of successful defense, the Leibstandarte withdrew because adjacent units had collapsed, creating threat of encirclement if they remained in position. This pattern tactical victory followed by strategic retreat became soul-destroying routine that eroded any sense that fighting mattered or that German military skill could overcome Soviet numerical advantages. The withdrawal across the Dnieper River in September represented both military necessity and psychological defeat. The Dnieper was one of Europe's major rivers, natural defensive barrier that German planning had identified as fallback position if summer offensives failed. Reaching it in retreat rather than holding it from strength symbolized how thoroughly German strategy had collapsed. Wehrmacht engineers demolished bridges, destroyed ferry sites, booby-trapped approaches to delay Soviet pursuit. The Leibstandarte crossed on pontoon bridges under Soviet artillery fire, losing men and equipment to shells that landed among crowded crossing points. Soviet forces established bridgeheads within days, attacking across the river before German defenders could establish coherent defensive line, beginning another cycle of attack and withdrawal that would continue through autumn. October brought fighting around Kremenchug, where Soviet forces had established substantial bridgehead on the western bank. The Leibstandarte counterattacked repeatedly, attempting to eliminate the bridgehead before it could be expanded and used as springboard for deeper operations. The attacks followed textbook German tactics reconnaissance to identify weak points, concentrated assault with armor and infantry, exploitation of any breakthrough. They failed not from poor execution but from Soviet learning and adaptation. Soviet defensive positions absorbed German attacks through layered defenses, mobile reserves, and artillery coordination that matched or exceeded German capabilities. The Red Army that had collapsed in 1941 had learned combined arms warfare through catastrophic experience, now fielding forces that could match German tactical proficiency while retaining vast numerical superiority. The autumn Rasputitsa mud season, when unpaved roads became impassable, arrived in late October, slowing operations for both sides, but favouring defenders. The Leibstandarte established defensive positions west of Kiev, holding sectors that army units could not adequately defend. Casualties continued from artillery, snipers, patrol actions, and small-scale attacks that achieved nothing except adding names to casualty lists. Medical officers like Franz Becker treated endless stream of wounded, traumatic amputations from mines, burns from vehicle fires, shrapnel wounds from artillery, frostbite cases as winter approached. The wounded were evacuated when possible, but transportation shortages meant some remained with units for days, suffering in improvised aid stations, dying from wounds that would have been survivable with rapid evacuation. The war had become an industrial process that consumed men as methodically as factories consumed raw materials. By December 1943, the Leibstandarte had suffered approximately 2,400 casualties, killed, wounded, or missing since Kursk ended, 5 months earlier. This represented nearly 25% of the division's combat strength losses that accumulated from continuous small-scale actions rather than major battles. The replacement system struggled to keep pace, with new soldiers arriving inadequately trained, being thrown into combat within days, and frequently dying before learning survival skills that veterans took for granted. This created a vicious cycle where losses increased because replacements were poorly trained, and replacements remained poorly trained because the Eastern Front's demands prevented adequate preparation. The division remained designated as elite formation and still fought more effectively than average Wehrmacht divisions, but the gap was narrowing as veteran numbers declined and replacement quality degraded. Equipment attrition paralleled human casualties, with vehicles and weapons wearing out from continuous use without adequate maintenance. Tanks required major overhauls after certain operational hours, but the tactical situation rarely allowed extended maintenance periods. Crews performed field repairs, jury-rig solutions to mechanical problems, and operated vehicles that should have been deadlined for safety reasons. This degraded both performance and reliability. Tanks broke down during attacks, weapons jammed at critical moments, vehicles caught fire from mechanical failures rather than enemy action. The Leibstandarte's equipment readiness rates by December 1943 showed only 60% of vehicles operational, with the remainder awaiting parts, repairs, or replacement. The division that had arrived at Kursk with 131 tanks fielded approximately 70 operational tanks by year's end. The difference composed of combat losses, mechanical failures, and cannibalization of damaged vehicles to keep others running. Morale among combat troops oscillated between grim determination and exhausted apathy. Soldiers continued performing duties because alternatives, desertion, surrender, refusing orders meant death or worse. Unit cohesion remained surprisingly strong despite continuous casualties, with survivors bonding over shared suffering and collective survival. But the ideological fervour that characterised the original Leibstandarte had largely evaporated among frontline troops, replaced by cynical professionalism that found purpose in immediate tactical objectives rather than grand strategic visions. Letters home, when soldiers had energy to write them, described exhaustion, cold, hunger, and desperate desire for leave, rather than expressing confidence in victory or enthusiasm for continued fighting. Censors removed explicit defeatism but could not hide the emotional depletion that permeated correspondence from combat troops who had endured too much for too long. The partisan problem intensified as German forces retreated, with Soviet irregular forces operating increasingly effectively in German rear areas. Leibstandarte units assigned to anti-partisan operations conducted sweeps through villages suspected of supporting guerrillas, usually destroying the villages and executing civilians without meaningful investigation into actual partisan connections. These operations were criminally disproportionate responses that violated any reasonable interpretation of military necessity, but they had become routine collective punishment as standard procedure, atrocity as policy. Some soldiers participated enthusiastically, others mechanically, a few reluctantly, but virtually none refused or reported the crimes. The organizational culture punished conscience more severely than it punished atrocity, creating conditions where murder was safer than mercy. Franz Becker, the medical officer treating wounded during the withdrawal, survived 1943 but was killed in January 1944 when Soviet artillery struck his aid station. He had treated approximately 3,000 wounded soldiers during his 18 months on the Eastern Front, saving many through skill and improvisation, watching many others die from wounds or inadequate medical supplies. His death was random rather than heroic, wrong place when shells landed, no time for treatment or evacuation, death essentially instantaneous. His replacement arrived 3 days later, a 22-year-old doctor, fresh from medical school, trained in peacetime standards that had no relevance to field conditions. The new doctor lasted 5 weeks before nervous breakdown required his evacuation. The position's third occupant, an older physician recalled from retirement, managed to serve through spring before dying from typhus contracted from patients. The Eastern Front consumed medical officers as efficiently as it consumed combat soldiers, grinding through trained professionals who could not be replaced adequately because no training system could produce doctors fast enough to match casualty rates. July 27th, 1943. A train platform in Innsbruck, Austria. SS Sturmbannführer Wolfgang Dietrich, battalion commander, watches his troops board trains heading south toward Italy. The orders came suddenly, elements of the Leibstandarte being rushed to northern Italy following Mussolini's overthrow and arrest. Hitler fears Italy will switch sides, requiring German forces to secure the country before former allies become active enemies. Dietrich's battalion numbers approximately 800 men, exhausted from Kursk fighting, desperately needing rest but instead being thrust into new theatre with unclear mission and potential enemies on all sides. The deployment of Leibstandarte units to Italy in summer 1943 reflected Hitler's paranoia about Allied reliability and his determination to control Italian territory regardless of Rome's political decisions. Approximately half the division, roughly 8,000 men, deployed to northern Italy, while the remainder continued fighting in Ukraine. The split deployment reduced effectiveness in both theatres but satisfied Hitler's need to position absolutely reliable SS troops where political considerations mattered as much as military capability. Wehrmacht units could be trusted to fight external enemies, but Hitler believed only SS formations would reliably suppress potential Italian opposition and secure territory against both Allied invasion and Italian betrayal. This reflected both his accurate understanding that the Leibstandarte would commit any atrocity he ordered and his growing distrust of Wehrmacht loyalty. The Leibstandarte's arrival in Italy created immediate tension with Italian military units that had been fighting alongside Germans but now faced uncertain futures. Italian soldiers watched SS troops with suspicion and fear, recognizing that these were not normal military forces but political enforcers whose presence suggested German distrust. Leibstandarte units positioned themselves near Italian military installations, prepared to disarm former allies at first sign of defection. The atmosphere resembled occupation more than alliance, with German troops treating Italian territory as conquered rather than friendly. This created bizarre situations where German and Italian soldiers stood guard near each other, theoretically allies but practically preparing for potential combat, neither side certain what the next days would bring. August passed, intense waiting as Italian political crisis deepened. Leibstandarte troops conducted training exercises near Italian positions, ostensibly normal military activity but clearly reconnaissance and intimidation. They secured critical road junctions, rail facilities, and communication centres. Actions justified as defending against Allied invasion, but obviously positioning for operations against Italians. Some fraternization occurred between German and Italian soldiers, shared meals, card games, conversations in broken language but always with underlying tension that friendship might become combat with minimal warning. Veterans of Eastern Front found Italy surreal after Ukraine's brutality, sleeping in actual buildings, eating relatively fresh food, facing no combat stress beyond waiting and uncertainty. The Italian armistice announcement on September 8th transformed theoretical preparation into immediate action. Within hours of the announcement, Leibstandarte units moved to disarm Italian formations throughout their operational area. Most Italian units surrendered without resistance, recognizing that fighting was pointless and dangerous. Some Italian officers attempted negotiation, seeking terms that would preserve unit honor while avoiding bloodshed. Leibstandarte commanders showed minimal interest in negotiation. They demanded immediate surrender of all weapons and acceptance of German military control, with no discussion permitted. Italian soldiers who complied were disarmed and released. Those who resisted were shot. The operation was conducted with mechanical efficiency that suggested extensive planning, which indeed had occurred during the preceding weeks of apparent inactivity. The security operation for Mussolini's rescue at Gran Sasso on September 12th involved Leibstandarte troops providing ground security, while SS Hauptsturmführer Otto Skorzeni's paratroopers conducted the actual raid. Leibstandarte units secured approach routes, established security perimeter, and prepared for potential Italian counterattack that never materialized. The operation succeeded brilliantly, rescuing Mussolini without German casualties and providing propaganda coup that temporarily boosted German morale. Leibstandarte participation was tangential but sufficient for SS propaganda to claim credit for the success. This pattern of exaggerated credit claiming continued throughout the war, with SS formations appropriating achievements or inflating their role in shared operations, creating resentment from Wehrmacht units who performed actual work while SS received publicity. The Italian deployment provided unexpected benefits despite its strategic irrelevance. Troops enjoyed relative safety compared to Eastern Front, with minimal casualties from September through December 1943. The mild Italian climate, abundant food compared to Russia, and absence of immediate combat stress allowed physical and psychological recovery that would have been impossible if they had remained in Ukraine. Vehicles received maintenance, equipment was repaired or replaced, replacements were integrated with more time than usual for training. This unplanned rest period significantly improved the division's combat capability when they returned to Russia, though the cost was weakening German defences in Ukraine by removing elite units during critical period. The strategic calculus was debatable. Did Italian security justify reducing Eastern Front strength? Or did Hitler's political paranoia create military problems that outweighed any benefits gained? Relationships with Italian civilians ranged from correct to exploitative, depending on individual German soldiers' character and local conditions. Some Leibstandarte troops respected Italian culture, paid for goods purchased, behaved as disciplined soldiers. Others treated Italians with contempt, appropriating property, exploiting economic desperation, treating former allies as conquered subjects. The organizational culture permitted both behaviors, creating inconsistency that reflected individual character rather than institutional standards. This was characteristic of SS formations generally combining genuine military professionalism with criminal opportunism, sometimes in the same individuals depending on circumstances and supervision. The absence of brutal atrocities during Italian deployment reflected not moral improvement, but lack of opportunity, no combat that might justify prisoner executions, no partisan warfare requiring collective punishment, no racial enemies triggering ideological violence. October brought orders for Leibstandarte units to return to the Eastern Front, ending the Italian interlude. Troops who had enjoyed relative peace for 3 months faced return to Ukraine with understandable reluctance. The contrast between Italy's safety and Russia's horror was stark enough that some soldiers considered deliberate injury or illness to avoid return, though few actually attempted such measures because consequences for discovered malingering were severe. The return journey by rail took days, carrying soldiers from Mediterranean warmth toward Ukrainian winter, from relative safety towards certainty of renewed combat. Veterans recognized the pattern: brief respites between Eastern Front deployments, temporary survival, followed by return to attrition warfare that would eventually kill or cripple most of them. Wolfgang Dietrich, the battalion commander who deployed to Italy in July, returned to Ukraine in October with his unit intact and relatively rested. He would die in February 1944 during the Korsun-Cherkasy pocket fighting, shot by a Soviet sniper while observing forward positions. His death was typical of Eastern Front casualties among officers: random, sudden, professionally pointless. The battalion he commanded continued fighting under new leadership, suffering continuous attrition until the original 800 men he brought to Italy were reduced to fewer than 200 survivors by summer 1944. The survivors were distributed to other units as the division rebuilt yet again, and the battalion designation was assigned to an entirely new formation composed of replacements who knew nothing of Italy except stories told by the few remaining veterans who remembered sleeping in beds and eating real food during the strange months when war briefly resembled something other than mechanized slaughter. January 28th, 1944, near Korsun-Cherkasy, Ukraine. SS Unterscharführer Stefan Richter, Panzergrenadier squad leader, watches from a forward observation position as Soviet forces complete encirclement of 56,000 German troops. His squad occupies positions outside the pocket, part of the Leibstandarte relief force that will attempt to break through Soviet lines and rescue the trapped armies. The mission is suicidal in all but name, attacking through entrenched Soviet positions in winter, outnumbered, with limited artillery support, attempting to reach comrades who are themselves fighting desperately to survive. Richter joined the Leibstandarte in 1942, survived Kursk and the long retreat, and has learned that survival requires luck more than skill. He studies the Soviet positions through binoculars, calculating approach routes and identifying firing positions, knowing that tomorrow he will lead his squad into killing ground where many will die. The Korsun-Cherkasy encirclement resulted from Soviet operational success during their winter offensive, trapping 2 German corps in a pocket approximately 50 kilometers in diameter. The trapped forces included both Wehrmacht and SS units, reasonably well supplied initially but facing inevitable destruction if relief did not arrive quickly. Higher command ordered the Leibstandarte and other SS divisions to break through from outside while encircled forces attempted breakout from inside. The operation required coordination between forces separated by Soviet armies, conducted in winter conditions that made communication difficult and movement exhausting. The relief attempt began on February 4th, with Leibstandarte units attacking through snow and Soviet defences, attempting to create corridor through which encircled troops could escape. The relief attacks gained ground through combination of tactical skill and terrible casualties. Leibstandarte. Panzer Grenadiers advanced through waist-deep snow, attacking Soviet positions that had been fortified for weeks. Artillery support was limited by ammunition shortages and difficulty observing targets in winter conditions. Tank support was reduced by mechanical failures and fuel scarcity. The attacks succeeded through infantry determination, soldiers advancing under fire, accepting casualties, maintaining momentum through leadership and unit cohesion that ordinary units could not sustain. Each day's advance gained several kilometers, destroying Soviet defensive positions, creating gradual approach toward the pocket. But Soviet reserves counterattacked continuously, forcing Germans to defend captured ground, slowing progress that needed to be rapid to save encircled troops before their supplies expired. The breakthrough on February 16th represented temporary tactical success built on horrific sacrifice. The Leibstandarte had advanced approximately 15 kilometers in 12 days, suffering 326 killed and 1,400 wounded. They established tenuous corridor to the pocket's edge, just as encircled forces began their breakout attempt. The coordination was imperfect but adequate. Escaping troops poured through the gap while Leibstandarte units held flanks against Soviet attacks attempting to close the corridor. The breakout was chaos rather than orderly withdrawal, with soldiers running through artillery fire, abandoning heavy equipment, carrying wounded comrades, racing toward German lines before Soviet forces sealed the gap. Approximately 35,000 soldiers escaped, 15,000 were killed or captured, most heavy equipment was lost. The operation was simultaneously rescue success and operational disaster. The immediate aftermath of the relief operation saw the Leibstandarte assigned to hold newly established defensive positions, preventing Soviet exploitation of German weakness. Casualties had reduced battalion combat strength by approximately 30% in 2 weeks of continuous operations. Survivors were physically and psychologically exhausted, having fought without adequate rest, proper food, or relief from combat stress. The rescued soldiers, grateful for their lives, nonetheless represented additional burden on supply systems already strained beyond capacity. The operation had preserved human resources at cost of consuming material resources that could not be replaced, a trade-off that made tactical sense but contributed to strategic deterioration as Germany's equipment reserves approached exhaustion. The cleansing operations that followed the Korsun-Cherkasy fighting demonstrated how brutality became normalized organizational response to operational stress. Leibstandarte units swept through villages in the operational area, executing civilians accused of supporting partisans or Soviet forces. The accusation criteria were arbitrary, sometimes based on denunciations from other villagers, settling personal scores, sometimes on presence of military-age males, sometimes on nothing except unit commanders' suspicion or desire for revenge against any available targets. Villages were burned systematically, livestock slaughtered or appropriated, surviving civilians driven into winter without shelter or food. These actions violated any reasonable military necessity doctrine and constituted war crimes under any legal framework, but they occurred routinely with institutional approval extending to division command level. The massacre at Yanovka on February 20th exemplified the pattern. Leibstandarte troops entered the village, assembled approximately 180 civilians in the central square, and executed them with machine gun fire. Survivors testified after the war that victims included women, children, and elderly people who could not possibly constitute military threats. The justification claimed partisan activity in the area, though no evidence of specific resistance was ever presented. The massacre was photographed by Wehrmacht soldiers, creating documentary evidence that survived the war and enabled later war crimes investigations. No participants were punished during the war. Most escaped prosecution afterward through destroyed records, false identities, or statute of limitations. The massacre was typical rather than exceptional, one incident among hundreds that characterized Leibstandarte operations throughout the Eastern Front campaign. Individual soldiers responded to participation in atrocities through psychological mechanisms that enabled continued functioning without confronting moral implications. Some genuinely believed victims were enemies who deserved death, accepting propaganda about partisan threats and racial inferiority. Others participated mechanically, following orders without allowing conscious moral evaluation, compartmentalizing actions from identity. Many adopted group diffusion of responsibility, individual culpability dissolved into collective action where no single person felt personally guilty. A minority experienced moral injury, psychological damage from actions that violated personal ethical frameworks, but organizational culture provided no support for such reactions and actually punished their expression. The result was force that could commit atrocities routinely while maintaining combat effectiveness, suggesting that moral behavior and military capability were independent variables that could be separated under sufficient institutional pressure. The Korsun-Cherkasy operation's strategic impact was minimal despite its tactical drama. German forces rescued significant numbers of troops, but at cost of casualties and equipment losses that weakened defensive capabilities elsewhere. Soviet forces learned from the operation's partial failure, improving encirclement techniques and relief prevention that would prove devastatingly effective later. The Leibstandarte demonstrated continued combat effectiveness, but also demonstrated that even elite forces could not sustainably conduct relief operations against competent enemies with numerical superiority. The operation represented microcosm of German strategic situation, tactical proficiency, insufficient to overcome fundamental disadvantages in resources, geography, and opponent capabilities. Stefan Richter, the squad leader who attacked into the relief operation, survived Korsun but was killed 3 weeks later during Soviet spring offensive. A mine destroyed his half-track, killing him and 4 squad members instantly. His replacement lasted 10 days before being wounded severely enough to require evacuation. The squad's third leader in a month was a veteran transferred from a destroyed unit who survived through May before capture during Soviet summer offensive. The squad itself lost cohesion through continuous casualties, being repeatedly rebuilt with replacements who lacked veteran experience and usually died quickly. By June 1944, none of the original squad members who fought at Korsun remained, all dead, wounded, or transferred. The squad designation persisted but meant nothing except continuation of unit number applied to completely different men who inherited nothing except the geographic position in the line that their predecessors had occupied and died defending. June 7th, 1944. A field command post near Caen, France. SS Brigadeführer Kurt Meyer, newly promoted division commander, receives reports of Allied invasion beginning on D-Day -1. Meyer is 43 years old, one of the original Leibstandarte members, veteran of every major campaign, known for tactical brilliance and absolute ruthlessness. The division he now commands occupies reserve positions inland from the beaches, designated as Mobile Counterattack Force to destroy Allied beachheads before they can be consolidated. Meyer orders immediate movement toward the coast, but Allied air supremacy makes daylight travel suicidal. Jabos, fighter bombers, attack anything moving on French roads. The division must advance at night, hide during day, arrive piecemeal rather than concentrated. This is fundamentally different warfare than the Eastern Front, facing enemies with unlimited material resources, complete air superiority, and professional competence that matches German capabilities. The Leibstandarte's deployment to Normandy represented strategic gamble based on Hitler's conviction that defeating Allied invasion was Germany's last chance to avoid total defeat. The division had been rebuilt in Belgium following Eastern Front losses, brought to full strength with replacements and new equipment. They deployed to France as Army Group West's most powerful reserve division, expected to throw invaders back into the sea through speed and shock. But the deployment immediately encountered problems that doctrine had not adequately addressed. Allied fighter bombers struck road columns continuously, destroying vehicles, forcing dispersion, delaying concentration. The 40-kilometre movement from assembly areas to Caen took 36 hours instead of the planned 4, with vehicle losses exceeding 20% before engaging Allied ground forces. The Leibstandarte arrived exhausted, dispersed, and under strength before firing a shot at Allied troops. The first engagement near Orthy village on June 7th brought Leibstandarte forces into contact with Canadian units advancing inland from Juno Beach. The Canadians were professional soldiers with excellent equipment, supported by artillery and tanks, fighting with determination equal to any Wehrmacht formation. Initial Leibstandarte counterattacks achieved local successes through superior tactics and veteran experience, pushing Canadian units back several kilometres. But the attacks could not be sustained. Allied artillery concentrations destroyed German assembly areas. Allied airstrikes disrupted supply lines, and Canadian reserves counterattacked with force that matched German effort. By evening, Leibstandarte forces had gained little ground at cost of significant casualties and demonstrated that Western Allied armies were fundamentally different opponents than Soviet forces, fewer soldiers but better supported, professional rather than mass armies capable of matching German tactical expertise. The Ardennes Abbey massacre occurred during the June 7th fighting, demonstrating that the Leibstandarte's criminal behaviour persisted regardless of theatre or opponent. Meyer's headquarters was established in Ardennes Abbey, a medieval building near Orthy. Canadian prisoners captured during the day's fighting were brought to the Abbey, approximately 20 men. Meyer's unit executed them in the Abbey's garden, shooting unarmed prisoners in direct violation of Geneva Conventions. Bodies were buried hastily in the Abbey grounds. Survivors from Canadian units and French civilians witnessed executions or aftermath, providing testimony that would enable post-war prosecution. Meyer himself was directly implicated through witness testimony and circumstantial evidence, though he denied personal involvement. The massacre was typical Leibstandarte behaviour. Tactical situation produced prisoners. Prisoners were inconvenient or viewed as legitimate revenge targets, and unit killed them without hesitation or subsequent accountability until war's end. The battle for Carpiquet airfield demonstrated Allied material superiority, overwhelming German tactical skill. Canadian forces attacked the airfield on July 1st, supported by massed artillery and bomber strikes that devastated Leibstandarte defensive positions. The defenders fought with characteristic determination, counterattacking repeatedly, inflicting heavy Canadian casualties. But Allied forces simply absorbed losses and continued attacking, calling in artillery fire that Germans could not match in volume or accuracy, bringing forward reserves that Germans did not possess. After 4 days of fighting, Canadian forces controlled the ruins of the airfield, having achieved their objective through material attrition rather than tactical brilliance. Leibstandarte forces withdrew to secondary positions, having demonstrated combat effectiveness but also having learned that effectiveness was insufficient when enemies possessed overwhelming firepower and unlimited replacements. The fighting near Verrières Ridge during Operation Spring in late July represented the Normandy campaign's grinding climax for the Leibstandarte. Canadian and British forces attacked entrenched Leibstandarte positions repeatedly, attempting to break through toward Falaise. Each attack was preceded by artillery preparation that made First World War barrages seem modest, followed by armour and infantry advances that absorbed horrific casualties to gain minimal ground. Leibstandarte defenders fought from prepared positions, destroying dozens of Allied tanks, repelling attacks that should have overwhelmed them. But the tactical stalemate was actually strategic defeat. Allied forces could sustain casualties indefinitely while rebuilding for next attack, whereas German losses were irreplaceable. Each day's successful defence weakened the Leibstandarte slightly, grinding toward inevitable collapse through simple arithmetic. The Falaise pocket encirclement in August trapped the Leibstandarte and most of German forces in Normandy, creating catastrophe that mirrored Eastern Front encirclements in all but scale. Allied armies advancing from multiple directions compressed German forces into shrinking pocket, subjected them to artillery fire and air attack that operated without German interference, and methodically destroyed units attempting to escape. The Leibstandarte fought as rearguard, attempting to hold escape routes open while army units retreated through the gap. The fighting was desperate and chaotic, with units dissolving under pressure, soldiers abandoning equipment to escape on foot, formations losing coherence as commanders were killed or lost contact with their troops. Approximately half the Leibstandarte escaped the pocket. The remainder were killed or captured in the worst German defeat in the West since France 1940. The Normandy campaign's casualties destroyed the Leibstandarte as effective combat formation. Approximately 5,000 men killed, wounded, or missing from the division's 19,500 starting strength. Over 150 tanks lost from 177 in infantry. Most vehicles destroyed or abandoned. The survivors who escaped Falaise were exhausted, demoralised, and scattered across France. The division that had entered Normandy as Army Group West's elite reserve had been reduced to broken units struggling to reach Germany. Unlike after previous defeats, no comfortable occupation zone awaited, where the division could rebuild over months. Instead, they would be rushed into defensive fighting along Germany's borders, attempting to prevent Allied entry into the Reich itself. The organisational recovery would be incomplete, with replacements increasingly conscripted rather than volunteer, equipment increasingly obsolete or improvised, veteran leadership increasingly depleted through casualties that removed experienced officers and NCOs. Kurt Meyer survived the Normandy fighting and temporarily escaped capture, though he was wounded by shell fragments during the Falaise breakout. Post-war, he was tried for the Ardennes Abbey massacre and other war crimes, convicted and sentenced to death, later commuted to life imprisonment, with release in 1954 after serving 9 years. He wrote memoirs that portrayed the Leibstandarte as honourable soldiers and dismissed atrocity allegations as Allied propaganda. His testimony exemplified the pattern of selective memory and moral denial that characterised most Leibstandarte veterans' post-war accounts. They remembered tactical excellence and battlefield courage. They forgot or rationalised the murders, massacres, and systematic criminality. Meyer's willingness to commit atrocities personally while maintaining self-image as professional soldier revealed the cognitive dissonance that enabled Wehrmacht and SS officers to reconcile incompatible identities. The Normandy campaign's broader significance for the Leibstandarte marked final transition from offensive force to desperate defenders fighting delaying actions against inevitable defeat. They had proven they could fight Western allies effectively, but not defeat them. That tactical skill could not overcome material disadvantage, That elite status meant being ground down slightly more slowly than ordinary units. The remainder of the war would be variations on these themes, temporary tactical successes within broader strategic collapse, occasional victories that delayed rather than prevented defeat, combat effectiveness persisting even as organizational coherence dissolved. The division that had begun as Hitler's bodyguard, become an elite panzer division, and fought across Europe with skill and criminality, was entering its final phase, fragments of a military formation that persisted less because they were effective than because surrender or collapse seemed psychologically impossible to soldiers whose entire adult identity was built on the institution that was consuming them. December 16th, 1944, 5:30 in the morning, the Ardennes Forest, Belgium. SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper stands in his command half-track, watching the opening artillery barrage of Hitler's last offensive. 4,000 men under his command, Kampfgruppe Peiper, the Leibstandarte's spearhead formation, wait to exploit the breakthrough that German planning promises will split Allied armies and recapture Antwerp. Peiper knows the plan is fantasy, knows that even if initial attacks succeed, German forces lack fuel, air support, and reserves to sustain offensive against Allied material superiority. But orders are orders, and the Leibstandarte's culture demands obedience regardless of operational realism. The artillery barrage ends, darkness remains complete, and Peiper's battle group begins moving west through forest roads that are far too narrow for the column of 100 tanks and armoured vehicles following him. Operation Wacht am Rhein, the Ardennes offensive, represented Hitler's last attempt to regain strategic initiative through operational surprise and aggressive action. The plan called for 3 German armies to attack through the Ardennes, exploit weak American defences, capture fuel dumps to sustain the advance, cross the Meuse River and drive to Antwerp, splitting British and American forces. The operational concept was sound in abstract terms, but divorced from material. Reality. German forces lacked fuel for sustained mobile operations. Allied air power would devastate exposed columns once weather cleared, and American reserves would respond faster than German planning assumed. Kampfgruppe Peiper's mission was to advance rapidly, regardless of opposition, capturing bridges intact, maintaining momentum through speed rather than strength, creating psychological panic that would amplify tactical success into operational breakthrough. The first day's advance achieved initial surprise, breaking through American forward positions and penetrating approximately 15 kilometers. American units, surprised by the offensive's scale, retreated or were overrun, creating brief impression that breakthrough might succeed. But even during this successful period, warning signs appeared that should have alerted commanders to eventual failure. American resistance stiffened rapidly as reserves deployed. Road congestion prevented German reserves from reaching spearheads quickly, and fuel shortages began affecting mobility even before German forces captured American fuel dumps. Peiper's column advanced faster than adjacent units, creating dangerous salient that left his flanks exposed, but his orders emphasized speed over security, creating conditions for both dramatic penetration and potential disaster. The Bagnères-Malmedy massacre on December 17th revealed that Leibstandarte atrocities persisted even when the unit was fighting for survival. Peiper's column encountered American soldiers from an artillery observation battery near Bagnères Crossroads. The Americans surrendered after brief resistance. Approximately 120 prisoners assembled in a field. Leibstandarte troops machine-gunned the unarmed prisoners, killing 84 men. Some prisoners escaped and survived, providing testimony about the massacre. The killings were systematic rather than spontaneous soldiers, following patterns established over years of Eastern Front service, viewing prisoners as inconvenient burdens to be eliminated rather than protected. The massacre was photographed by American forces who recaptured the site, creating evidence that would enable post-war prosecution. Additional murders occurred along Peiper's route as his column advanced, with estimates suggesting over 350 American prisoners and Belgian civilians killed during the offensive. The advance toward the Meuse River continued through December 17th and 18th, with Piper's column covering approximately 60 kilometers in 3 days through difficult terrain and American resistance. This represented remarkable tactical achievement, maintaining offensive momentum under adverse conditions, navigating through unfamiliar terrain, defeating enemy positions, but the advance was creating unsustainable situation. American forces blocked most direct routes, forcing Piper onto secondary roads. Fuel consumption exceeded captured fuel, meaning the column was slowly immobilizing itself. Allied air power remained grounded by weather but would inevitably clear, exposing the column to devastating attack. Most critically, American reserves were deploying faster than German planning had anticipated, creating danger of encirclement rather than breakthrough. The encirclement at L'Église began on December 23rd when American forces blocked Piper's withdrawal routes, trapping his battle group in a small village near the Amblève River. Piper's force held approximately 800 men and 40 operational tanks, significant combat power, but insufficient to break through encircling American forces. Allied artillery pounded the village continuously, destroying buildings, killing soldiers, denying rest or security. American units probed defenses, searching for weak points while preventing German escape. Piper attempted breakout attacks, but American positions were too strong, repelling assaults and tightening the encirclement. After 3 days, Piper recognized his situation was hopeless. Fuel exhausted, ammunition depleting, wounded accumulating, no prospect of relief. He faced the same decision German commanders had faced repeatedly during the war's final years: fight until destroyed or attempt escape and accept losses. The breakout on December 26th represented tactical defeat disguised as escape success. Piper ordered his men to abandon all vehicles and equipment, organizing approximately 800 survivors to escape on foot through American lines during darkness. The breakout succeeded partially through American oversight, gaps in encirclement that should have been covered but weren't, and partially through Leibstandarte soldiers' experience with dangerous situations. Approximately 770 men reached German lines, leaving behind 40 tanks, 60 armored vehicles, all heavy equipment, and wounded soldiers who could not travel on foot. The successful personal escape of most soldiers could not disguise the military disaster, and elite battle groups' equipment destroyed, their mission failed, and their commander retreating after achieving nothing except atrocities that would enable war crimes prosecution. The Ardennes offensive's broader failure became apparent by early January as Allied forces counterattacked and German units withdrew to start positions. The offensive had delayed Allied advance by approximately 6 weeks, killed or captured substantial American forces, and created temporary crisis. But it had also consumed Germany's last operational reserves, expended fuel and ammunition that could not be replaced, and demonstrated conclusively that German armed forces could no longer conduct successful offensives, even against surprised enemies. The Leibstandarte's role in the offensive exemplified this pattern: tactical proficiency producing temporary success that could not be sustained or exploited, with criminal behavior alongside combat effectiveness creating dual legacy of military capability and moral catastrophe. Post-war prosecution of Malmedy massacre participants revealed the challenges of bringing war criminals to justice when evidence was substantial but defendants were skilled at avoiding responsibility. Piper and 72 other defendants were tried at Dachau in 1946, with 43 receiving death sentences, including Piper. But appeals, Cold War politics, and questions about interrogation methods led to sentences being commuted. Piper was released in 1956 after serving 11 years. He lived quietly in France until 1976, when he was murdered under mysterious circumstances, possibly by resistance groups or private individuals seeking revenge for wartime actions. Most other massacre participants either died during the war, escaped prosecution through destroyed records, or received relatively light sentences that were further reduced during the 50s as Germany became Cold War ally rather than defeated enemy. The Ardennes offensive marked the Leibstandarte's final operation as a coherent formation. Survivors withdrew to Germany, receiving minimal replacements and obsolete equipment, conducting defensive fighting along Germany's borders through early 1945. The division designation persisted and would be used in final operations in Hungary and Austria, but the organisation that had begun as Hitler's bodyguard had essentially ceased to exist as functioning military unit. What remained were fragments of veterans scattered among replacement troops who never knew the original Leibstandarte, using equipment that ranged from captured Allied material to obsolete German models, fighting battles whose only objective was delaying inevitable defeat by days or weeks. Joachim Peiper survived the war, served his prison time, and lived until 1976, longer than most Leibstandarte soldiers who died during the war or in the desperate final months when Germany collapsed around them. His survival and relatively light punishment exemplified broader patterns where many war criminals escaped justice through bureaucratic failures, destroyed evidence, or political calculations that prioritized Cold War needs over accountability for past crimes. March 16th, 1945. A destroyed village in Hungary. SS Unterscharführer Peter Hartmann, 22 years old, sits in a ruined building watching Soviet tanks approach through morning fog. His company numbers 43 men from authorized strength of 180, not soldiers but survivors, remnants of units destroyed repeatedly and rebuilt with whoever remained alive. The Leibstandarte division designation still exists but means nothing. Scattered battle groups fighting independent actions, losing contact with higher command, retreating toward Germany through collapsing front lines. Hartmann joined the division in January 1945, trained for 3 weeks, and has been in continuous combat since deployment. He has learned that survival depends on luck more than skill, that orders from higher command have no connection to tactical reality, and that defeat is certain regardless of how bravely anyone fights. Hitler's fury at the Leibstandarte's unauthorized retreat from Hungary in March 1945 produced one of history's most darkly absurd moments. The division, fighting desperately against overwhelming Soviet forces, withdrew to prevent encirclement and destruction. Hitler, receiving reports in Berlin bunker while Soviet forces approached the city, interpreted the withdrawal as cowardice and betrayal. He ordered Sepp Dietrich and all Leibstandarte soldiers to remove their cuff bands, the sleeve insignia bearing Hitler's name that had marked the division since 1933. Dietrich reportedly threw his decorations in a chamber pot rather than formally returning them, a gesture of contempt that risked execution, but accurately reflected frontline soldiers' assessment of higher command's disconnect from reality. The order was never effectively implemented. Soldiers in combat had more immediate concerns than uniform regulations, but it symbolized the complete breakdown of the relationship between Hitler and his once fanatical Bodyguard division. The final combat operations in Austria during April 1945 consisted of small unit actions without operational coherence or strategic purpose. Leibstandarte remnants fought near Vienna, attempting to delay Soviet advance toward the Austrian capital. The battles were characterized by brief defensive stands followed by retreats, equipment abandoned due to fuel shortages, wounded left behind because evacuation was impossible, and growing numbers of soldiers simply walking away from their units rather than continuing pointless resistance. The organizational coherence that had sustained the division through previous catastrophes had finally dissolved. Completely units fragmented into isolated groups, officers lost contact with their men, and the institutional identity that had defined the Leibstandarte ceased to exist, except as memories shared by increasingly scattered survivors. The surrender negotiations in early May varied by unit and location, with some Leibstandarte groups fighting to the last day, while others ceased resistance days before Germany's official capitulation. Units that surrendered to American forces generally fared better than those captured by Soviets, though both sides treated SS prisoners more harshly than Wehrmacht soldiers. Leibstandarte officers attempted to hide their identities, removing SS insignia, falsifying documents, claiming to be Wehrmacht soldiers. Some succeeded temporarily, avoiding immediate identification and harsh treatment. Others were identified through tattoos, SS blood type markings on the upper arm, or through denunciations from other prisoners. The post-surrender period was characterized by fear, uncertainty, and recognition that SS service might result in summary execution or lengthy imprisonment. The immediate post-war period saw Allied forces investigating Leibstandarte war crimes across multiple theatres and years. Evidence was substantial survivor testimony, photographs, documented massacres, bodies buried in mass graves, The challenges were identifying individual perpetrators, establishing chains of command, and prosecuting defendants who could afford legal representation and mounted sophisticated defenses. The Malmedy trial prosecuted massacre participants, achieving some convictions but facing legal challenges that reduced sentences. Other investigations faced greater difficulties: witnesses dead, records destroyed, perpetrators escaped to South America or absorbed into civilian populations under false identities. The majority of Leibstandarte war criminals escaped prosecution not because evidence was insufficient, but because practical realities of post-war justice prevented comprehensive accountability. Sepp Dietrich's post-war experience exemplified senior commanders' trajectories. He was tried and convicted for his role in the Night of the Long Knives murders committed in 1934, receiving 18-month sentence. He was separately tried and convicted for Malmedy massacre, receiving 25-year sentence. The two sentences were served concurrently, and he was released in 1955 after serving approximately 9 years total. He lived quietly in Bavaria until his death in 1966, receiving state pension as retired general, despite war crimes convictions. His experience revealed how quickly political calculations replaced accountability. Germany became Cold War ally, former Wehrmacht and SS officers were needed for new German military forces, and extended imprisonment of war criminals seemed less important than rebuilding relationships with former enemies. Kurt Meyer's post-war career followed similar pattern, convicted of war crimes related to Ardennes Abbey and other murders, sentenced to death, sentence commuted to life imprisonment, released in 1954 after serving 9 years. He wrote memoirs portraying the Leibstandarte as professional soldiers who fought honourably, dismissing atrocity allegations as victors' justice. His memoirs influenced public perception, creating narratives where SS combat divisions were supposedly distinct from death camp guards, where atrocities were aberrations rather than policy, where soldiers were simply following orders in impossible situations. These narratives served political purposes in Cold War Germany, but fundamentally misrepresented historical reality. The Leibstandarte's combat effectiveness was inseparable from their criminality, both flowing from institutional culture that recognized no constraints on violence. Wilhelm Mohnke, who participated in the Long Knives, commanded troops responsible for Wormhout massacre, and served throughout the war, was captured by Soviets and imprisoned until 1955. He denied all war crime allegations despite substantial evidence claiming he knew nothing about atrocities committed by units under his command. After release, he lived quietly in Hamburg, declining most interviews, maintaining silence about his wartime service. He died in 2001 at age 90, having outlived most Leibstandarte veterans, never prosecuted despite documented involvement in multiple war crimes. His long life and freedom exemplified how many perpetrators escaped justice through combination of destroyed evidence, legal technicalities, Cold War politics, and simple passage of time that made prosecution increasingly difficult. Statistical analysis of Leibstandarte casualties revealed the human cost of the unit's combat employment. Estimates suggest approximately 35,000 to 40,000 men served in the Leibstandarte during the war across all iterations and rebuildings. Casualties killed, missing, permanently disabled probably exceeded 25,000, creating casualty rate exceeding 60%. Infantry companies and tank crews suffered even higher rates, with some units experiencing complete turnover multiple times. The casualties were not distributed evenly. Original volunteers from 1933 to 1940 experienced higher survival rates because they received most training and served during Germany's victorious period, while later conscripts faced lower survival odds. The division's final strength at surrender was approximately 1,600 men, less than 10% of authorized full strength. Historical assessment of the Leibstandarte must balance their undeniable combat effectiveness against their systematic criminality. Military historians recognize them as elite formation that fought skillfully across multiple theaters, demonstrating tactical proficiency and operational flexibility. They were genuinely effective soldiers by professional military standards. achieving objectives that ordinary units could not accomplish. But this effectiveness